It was around 4 years ago now, I think. I was 25 years old and I was working with a door-to-door sales company. I had moved down to England as a better job opportunity within the company came up, and I thought, why not? Nothing's holding me back at home. About 6 months down the line, I was told that they wanted me to work in the office back home for a week. With my job, this was really common. We called them road trips, and I jumped at the chance so I could go home and see my friends for a week. It fell on a Saturday. I had been working out in my area, and business was usually pretty slow on a Saturday, as not many people are at home. I got a Facebook message from a guy I worked with called Stephen. Stephen was a guy who I had met on one of our previous road trips, and he seemed like a pretty okay guy. But he was a bit quirky. He had a strange sense of humor, but he seemed like a lovable kind of person if you got past the fact that he stares at you a lot and acted kind of weird. I'm quite an outgoing person, and I just like to make friends with everyone. He messaged me asking if I wanted to grab a drink after work. I obliged as I hadn't been home in 6 months and I thought it would be cool to catch up. He told me that his flatmates would be home and we could all grab some pizza and beers. It sounded perfect. We arranged a meeting time and a place and it was all set. Now, with my job, our hours are pretty long. Some of us would be in the office until 11 PM. By the time I got back to the office and sorted everything out, it was past 9:30 PM, and my last train home was in an hour. I messaged Stephen explaining that I wasn't going to be able to make it, as I would miss my last train and hopefully could catch up with him before I go home. He immediately rings me on my mobile phone. He sounded nervous, like more so than usual. He explained that there was a spare bedroom at his and it wouldn't be an issue if I crashed on his spare bed. And according to Stephen, his flat was a 10-minute walk from town. I saw no issue with this, and I could just walk to work in the morning and agreed to meet him in the place we arranged. This is when things started to get weird. I'm waiting for him, and he turns up looking very sprightly. We give each other a big hug. He then leads the way, and as I follow, he tries to hold my hand. I did an awkward shuffle, so I couldn't hold his hand, and brushed it off as him being awkward. I should have just gone home at this point. Anyway, so we're walking to his flat, and I have absolutely no idea where it's located. Since we were laughing and joking and catching up, I didn't realize that we had been walking for a good half an hour. On the phone he said that he lived 10 minutes away from town. We finally get to his flat, and I noticed that it's situated down a steep hill in a heavily wooded area. I kinda just shrugged it off, but I did notice that I got no 3G there, and my signal was showing no service. We get in and I take off my shoes and jacket, and I notice that the flat is empty. I ask where his housemates are, and he said that they had gone out for a bit. He then makes us some pizza and hands me a beer. I'm quite a slow drinker. Beer isn't really my favorite drink. As I would get halfway down my bottle, he would hand me a fresh one. I would explain multiple times that I can't drink as fast as him, to the point where I had like 6 half-full beers beside me. He then asked me this: "Do you like the Scissor Sisters?" They're a band that I'm not into, especially not now. I said that they were okay, and he told me that his favorite song was Laura. I know this doesn't seem relevant right now, but it will soon. I was starting to get a little weirded out by this point, and noticed that I still had no signal on my phone. And it hit me that I didn't have a freaking clue where I was, and no signal to text anyone to come and get me. He then went on to ask if I was seeing anyone. I told him I was seeing the manager of the office I worked in, and that we were really happy. This was a lie though. I had been single for 2 years. The conversation moved on, and by this point, it was around midnight. As my job required me to be on my feet for 10 to 11 hours a day, I was getting pretty sleepy and asked if I could go to bed in the spare room he apparently had. He led me through to his bedroom, and I noticed that there was only one bedroom in the whole flat. So where would his flatmate sleep? His bedroom was quite small, and I noticed that his double bed consisted of 2 single mattresses pushed up against each other, and he had separated them and placed a blanket on my bed. I was too nervous to say anything, so I thought if I could just get through the night, I'd be fine, and sneak off as early as I could in the morning. He then said to me, "I'll run you a bath in the morning." which is when I noticed that the only bathroom that had a bath in it was an ensuite. I say thank you and stressed that I was feeling very tired from work and I'd see him in the morning. I then wrap myself up like a burrito and tell him that I need to listen to some music to fall asleep. I pretend to put my iPod on. I had the earphones in, but I wasn't playing any music. This was so if he tried anything, while he thought I was listening to music, I'd hear him. But this is when things get really messed up. I finally drift off at probably 1-ish. I'm then woken up at 1:30 with Stephen shaking me, saying that, "Your bath is ready." I wake up and realize that he had run me a bath in the ensuite at 1:30 in the morning. So I politely say thank you, but I'll have one before I go to work. I drift back off, only to be woken up again at 2:30. "Your bath is ready." I ignore him this time. 3:30. "Your bath is ready." At this point, I was really tired and I kind of snapped at him and said that I just needed my sleep. 4 o'clock, I woke up on my own. I can hear Stephen. He's awake and he's playing Laura by the Scissor Sisters over and over on a loop. I was half awake, half asleep by this point, so my brain didn't process what was happening. 4:30, I wake up again. I could hear a shuffled, beating noise from behind me. Now, where I was facing, there was a wardrobe with kind of mirrored doors, but it wasn't like an actual mirror. It was black PVC almost, but you could clearly see a reflection in it. And I see Stephen masturbating over me. He was literally jacking off over me as I slept. My brain just completely went into panic mode, and I didn't know what to do. So I just laid there until he was finished. But I'll never forget that, ever. 7:30. "Your bath's ready." By this point, I had absolutely had enough. I get up, really grumpily, and he's there in his boxer shorts. I tell him I need to leave and go to grab my stuff, and he grabs me. He pulled me into his arms from behind, almost flops us both backwards onto the bed, and starts violently stroking my hair and face. He had a tight grip, but the adrenaline had kicked in, and I freed myself. I locked myself in the bathroom with the full bath of water still intact. I then realized that the ensuite door didn't have a lock on it, and it was made out of shutter slat things, so he could easily see in while I was having a bath. I hid in the corner, not knowing what to do. I was completely trapped. I was on the verge of a panic attack by this point, so I sit in the corner for a good 40 minutes, and during that time, he must have asked me to come out like 8 times. I made a plan. I was going to tell him that there was an emergency, and I had to go. I know looking back, it might seem silly, but when your mind is in a complete state of panic, you don't think straight. I was still fully dressed from the night before, and I knew my handbag and shoes were out in the hallway. I made a run for it. I opened the door and he's standing there in his boxers with a cup of tea he'd made for me. Spiked, no doubt. I literally ran to the hallway, grabbed my shoes and bag, and unlocked the door faster than I've ever moved in my entire life. I don't know what would have happened if the keys weren't still on the front door. I ran so far up that hill and just kept running until I got to a main street. He didn't follow me. My phone then started to get a signal again, and he starts calling me. I kept hitting the cancel button, but it was no use. He wouldn't stop. Then he started texting me, saying that I'd left my earphones there, and I had to come back for them. Absolutely no way in hell was I going back there. I found a local Wetherspoons that was open, doing breakfast, and I went inside. I blocked his number, and blocked him on every form of social media that I could think of. I ordered a breakfast, and just cried for ages. That was the most terrifying ordeal of my life. I can't even bear to listen to the Scissor Sisters anymore. When I explained to the girls at work what had happened, they flipped. I didn't call the police or anything, but it certainly made me more wary that there were weirdos out there. Anyway, thanks for listening. It started off on Omegle. I'm an 18-year-old at the moment. Since I turned 13, I developed a habit of talking to strangers online. Every day after coming home from school, I used to talk to the numerous idiots, some decent people, some creeps, but nothing as bad as this. For some backstory, I generally followed a similar routine on most days. Monday to Thursdays, it was go to school, come home, and then just watch a few episodes of Friends or The Middle. On Fridays, I usually went out and chilled with my friends. Saturdays was just the day I went to the town centre where there were usually a lot of shops, cinemas and whatnot. I preferred to go out by myself on this day, though occasionally I went with friends. I just got home, jumped onto the computer, switching on my usual choice of music and just unwinding from a rough day at school. I watched some YouTube videos, a few episodes of Friends, and then after eating proceeded to go onto Omegle. After a few strangers and perverts, I came across a decent guy called Chris. Now Chris and I exchanged messages for about 40 to 50 minutes when I just told him a little bit about myself. Just some general information, nothing specific to be honest. Things I like to do, and that was basically it. He told me he was 18 years old and working at an ICT company as an apprentice. He seemed to have many of the same interests I did, which was a little cool because it gave us a lot to talk about. I casually told him that my web browser was acting up, to which he said, "Hey, I'm great with computers. My job involves working with them. You should totally download this application and I'll see what I can do for you if you want." Me being as innocent as I was, I agreed. The application he told me to download was either TeamViewer or Splashtop Streamer. The reason I wasn't hesitant was because there wasn't anything on my computer, no personal details, just some schoolwork and video games. It was pretty neat that he could just control my computer. I messaged Chris saying that I'm popping downstairs for 5 minutes and I'll be right back. I came back in within 3 minutes, seeing him erasing my web history. This didn't seem sketchy, as I had a problem with my browser. I asked him after he was done what he was doing. He said that the problem was all fixed, and it was. I thanked him and we spoke for about 20 minutes more. We planned to speak the following evening with some tags so the system matched us together. The next evening, we proceeded to speak. This time, however, he started acting up, asking why I was late. I said I was going to come online at 8 PM. I don't remember the exact time, but I know for a fact that I wasn't even that late, max 15 minutes. I told him not to speak to me like that, and asked why he was acting like a fucking idiot for. He went on saying, "Sorry, honey, I hope you can forgive me. I love you." Now, I'm not into guys, and these messages were freaking me out. I told him to stop, and he just sent me a few smiley faces. He then went on to say, "I know where you live, I know what school you go to," and things of that sort. Our town is a small one, and there wasn't any way that he could have guessed that. Things were uneventful for the next few days, until the following Saturday when I went shopping with some friends. We all grabbed something to eat, and then just sort of chilled on one of the benches chatting. A man then popped next to us, asking if he could sit down. I was a little apprehensive, but my friend said that they were public seats and we shouldn't stop him. He was standing on my friend's side, but when we allowed him to sit, he shifted right next to me. He just sat still there, not moving, not saying a word, but just looking straight ahead. He then turned toward me and smiled. I tried to get up, but he grabbed my shoulder, to which my friend started shouting. He then started shouting himself, directly in my ear, and casually walked away. My friends walked me home that night, but it got worse then. Someone started posting blank letters through the letterbox. We started getting random bangs on the door, and when we went out, there wasn't anyone there. When I passed my driving test, I got a letter congratulating me. It was typed up. We still get the letters, just not as frequently, and the police seem not to have believed a single word, but it's supposedly being investigated. When I was young, I lived in quite a small town in Queensland, Australia. The whole town was surrounded by bush in every direction for hundreds of kilometers, and we had so much room to play. This particular story is about the first time we got drunk. In the winter, the level of the water would drop significantly, enough for us to camp in the riverbed. My best mate's parents owned a pub at the time, so we were in charge of getting drinks for a little camping trip we had planned, so we could finally pop our drunk cherry. The place we had in mind was out near an old indigenous settlement, so we made our way down into the riverbank, which was low on the side we came in on, and really high on the other side. You couldn't see on the other side through all of the trees on the top, and it was kind of unnerving knowing someone could be there, watching, and you wouldn't even know. There are about 7 of us kids in the camp, and our parents have no idea where we are or what we're doing. We lied and said that we were staying at a friend's place. We set up our camp and built a shelter for all of us to sleep under. We are all set up and start drinking as the sun is setting. Soon it's dark and we're in full swing of mixing drinks and singing songs and throwing stuff in the water, and generally making a whole heap of noise. As we're starting to wind down, one of my friends says that he saw something move at the top of the riverbank on the steep side. We all say that he's full of shit and should calm down, but he is adamant that there is someone up there, so we all start calling out, "Come out, you pussy!" and other such things, being brave well beyond our years. To our surprise, a bearded man wearing straggly clothes and no shoes came out of the tree line, stands on the edge of the bank and just stares at us. We all go silent, waiting for him to do something. But for about 5 minutes, he just stands there, and then he retreats back into the tree line. We all talk amongst ourselves and get a bit nervous, but we soon forget it. About an hour later, the guy is back, but he isn't on the bank anymore. He is coming out of the shadows from the other side of the bank and entering our camp. He comes over and stands next to the fire, just joins our group of 12-year-old kids and stands there. We're all officially a bit scared and don't really know what to do, so we just sit there in silence. Eventually one of my friends gets up the courage to speak to him. "G'day mate, how are you? Are you okay?" The guy just stares at my friend and then starts staring at each of us in turn for a little bit. My friend tries again. "Hey, are you okay? What's your name?" The man snaps his head back at my friend and stares at him, wide-eyed for at least 2 minutes before answering. Without blinking, he says in a raspy whisper, "That's none of your fucking business." And then he hisses like a cat. Then this guy just jumps back screaming and staring at the fire like it had just appeared, and runs off up the steep bank in record time. It was impossible to get up this thing, so we all stand there, speechless. We decided that it's best if we just stoke the fire up because it's about a 19-kilometer walk in the pitch black back to town, and we weren't confident on that. So stoke the fire we did. We sat up for as long as we could keep watchful, not really talking. We all eventually dozed off, one by one. When we woke up in the morning, everything was gone. All of our alcohol, all of our bags, our shoes, and all of our blankets. I mean, everything. The creepy thing was that none of us awoke as someone robbed us blind. There was not one single footprint. We were sleeping in wettish sand, so there would have been footprints everywhere, but there were none. Honestly, it looked like we hadn't even been there. Needless to say, we bailed and ran most of the way back to town. Our feet were all cut up and messy by the time we got back. We never told our parents about our camping trip, and I think that we never will. One night I had fallen asleep on my back, which is very unusual for me. I tended to sleep on my side, but for whatever reason this time I didn't. While I slept, I kept my small box fan on because it was a warm night and I hate the feeling of overheating. I began to dream in my dream that I was preparing dinner for my family in the kitchen. One of my sisters, who was pregnant at the time, was standing outside of my bedroom. She opened the door and outran my black cat, which must have surprised her because she screamed. I began to laugh in my kitchen and said, "It's just Binks." I said this as I walked from the kitchen to the hallway to see if my sister was okay, and that's when my dream began to get weird. My sister was staring into my room, which was much darker than it should have been. "No," she whispered, "there's something in your room." I wiped my hands on a small towel and walked over to my room. "There's something in your room," she repeated as I stared along with her. As I looked into the pitch-black room, everything seemed to get foggy. "There's something in your room," she said again as I kept on looking. Toward the back of my room, I started to see something. A glowing pair of red eyes in the dark. As the eyes became clearer, I began to remember something, or feel like I was remembering something. It was like my brain was trying to bring up something that was forgotten a long time ago. My sister's voice kept saying, "There's something in your room," over and over again. Each time she repeated it, she said it faster and faster. Her voice faded and became the swooshing sound of the blades of my fan. The small fan was going way faster than its highest setting. It's going so quick that it's shaking and thudding against the wood of my nightstand. I opened my eyes, and that's when I felt a hand cover my mouth and something pin me down on my bed. It felt like someone was holding every one of my limbs to stop me from moving. A loud ringing began to go off in my ear and I could hear my heart beating rapidly in my chest. I started to fight and move my head and try to break free from whatever was holding me down. It was getting hard for me to breathe, and after what seemed like forever, I managed to escape the hand on my mouth and let out a yell. I fell out of bed and landed on the floor. I stumbled to my feet and ran out of the room. As I made my way through the house, I turned on every light, as if this would help in some way. In the back of my mind, I thought it was just sleep paralysis. To make myself a little better, I walked back to my room, turned on the light and began to speak. I said, "If there are any spirits in this room who wish to do me harm, you're not welcome here." I repeated that over and over before I sat back down on my bed. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. One of the reasons why is because I could feel something staring at me through my window. I felt like if I turned around to look out my window, I would see whatever it was that was holding me down. A day had passed when my neighbor came knocking on my door. She told my mum that she'd been trying to call because one of her security cameras showed what looked like a man standing outside my bedroom window at 3 a.m. When I was told about it, my sister's words started to repeat themselves in my head. "There's something in my room." The Indigenous people of Australia have up to 75 different dialects depending on the region where they come from, so the name of this being could be called something entirely different in other dialects, but my local tribe called it the Kardachi Man.
True scary stories found on the internet. I've only ever read one of these stories on my channel about a year ago, but like I said, they're all classics, so if you've heard any of them, I will be leaving timestamps for each story in the description and pinned comment just in case you want to skip past any. Now that that's out of the way, I hope you enjoyed the video and let's begin. I've always had an innate fear of the night. Not so much the dark, but the night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that come alive at night and the safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on, until a night when I decided to go with a buddy of mine to a baseball game and got stuck at a light at 2 a.m. after dropping him off at home. Of course, that night, the game went into extra innings, and so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off back home until well after 1 a.m. Everything was fine on the way home until I hit a light right before the street that led to my house. It was a T-junction and I was turning left. The light is one of those that you think is broken until it finally turns green right when you finally decide to just run it. So, of course, I pulled up right as the light turned red. I would have just run the light, seeing as no one was there and it was closing in on 2 a.m. on a school night. But earlier that week I had heard the phrase, "character is what you do when no one is looking," and for whatever reason, that was the night I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of character. Big mistake. I pulled to a stop at the light, feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out of my window to my left and noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact and I quickly looked away. It was too late. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision and knew she was coming my way. I looked out the window and noticed she was carrying a bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and that all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator just in case and braced myself for what was to come. I was hoping it would just be an awkward exchange and was praying for a quick light change before she reached me so I could just get out of there. But I knew there was a slim chance of that. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag, and began to tap on my window. I nervously looked up at her and she mentioned for me to put my window down. I had automatic windows, so I just imagined pushing too hard on the window button and that thing just coming all the way down. So I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it with my finger. The window moved microscopically down, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She then leaned in and began to talk. She said,
"My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?"
I should stop and give you a brief physical description of the bag lady. She was small and skinny and kind of an indeterminate age. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived a hard 20-plus years on the street, or she was 60-something years old who had lived a moderately hard life on the street. All that to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, not just by a boyfriend. But there was something about her delivery. It was robotic and seemed practiced, like she was disconnected for the moment. That made my skin crawl. And after a brief, maybe about a second debate on whether I should do it, I told her that I had to get home and that I couldn't give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in closer and said the same thing again.
"My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?"
This is a collection of some of the scariest and most interesting stories from the internet. I've never read any of these on my channel, but if you've heard any of these, I will be leaving timestamps for each story in the description and pinned comment just in case you want to skip past any. Now that that's out of the way, I hope you enjoyed the video and let's begin. This took place 10 years ago when I was a freshman in college. This is the first time I've ever recounted this story in full detail to anyone. I attended college in a rural mountain area in the Northeast, a small school tucked away in the rolling hills of the mountains, the type of place where the beauty and casual grace of nature is juxtaposed by the ugliness of humanity. The newspaper was ultra-conservative, and you couldn't go too deep into the woods beyond a few trees without seeing some trace of meth activity. You know the type of place I mean. Anyway, one of my new friends from college discovered somehow an abandoned train trestle deep into the woods about 5 miles from campus, basically in no man's land. I have no idea and don't remember how he found this place because it was very much off the path. The trestle crossed above a river which placidly flowed about 40 feet below. It was actually quite beautiful, and we began going there maybe 3 times a week. Just hanging out on the trestle, watching the water below and the open sky above. We'd drink 40s there, smoke a bowl there, bring some girls there, you know, stuff like that. Eventually, we began jumping off the trestle into the water below and then climbing back up. It was just a very college-y thing to do. Our chill spot, basically. So, one day, just needing to get away from the dorms and away from it all, I decided to go by myself to the trestle for a swim. It was about 7 p.m., so I still had a good hour or so of dim sunlight, and I brought a flashlight for the walk home when I was sure it would be dark. I made the trek through the pathways of the woods as I had done 100 times before, left my towel and flashlight on the trestle and jumped into the water. The water was about 10 to 15 feet deep, I'd say. It flowed almost imperceptibly. You might as well be swimming in a stagnant pool. However, about maybe 50 yards away from the trestle, the river narrows and the current picks up significantly. Then about 20 yards after that, there is a maybe 20-foot high waterfall that bubbles and splashes with extreme violence. We used to watch large objects go over and never come back up again. So there I am, dimly bobbing my head in and out of the water, doing underwater flips, etc. When I pop my head out of the water, I happen to glance to the side of the river and see a man walking towards the water. The water is kind of impeding my view, so I don't see him fluidly walking towards the water. I more see him in different stages of being closer to the water, like flipping through a flip book. He's 15 feet away, 10 feet away, 5 feet away. I can barely give you a description. Maybe 6 feet tall, pale, skinny, black hair pulled back in a ponytail. What I do remember most about his appearance was the extremely empty look on his face and in his eyes, like he was doing something mundane, like taking out the trash or raking leaves. I'm treading water, not knowing what to think, and I see that he is no longer beside the river. He dove in, and he's swimming pin straight directly at me so fast. I try to swim the opposite way, but within a minute I feel him grab my ankle and tug. I tried to scream, but water filled my mouth. While I'm underwater, he lets go and goes up for air, then grabs back on and pulls me again. It seems like he's done this before, and I never once saw him after he jumped into the water. He's gradually pulling me to where the current picks up before the waterfall. I start to realize this and just start fucking flipping out. I'm kicking, screaming, cursing to no effect. Finally, I feel the current start to take me and I twist away towards the waterfall. I look back and I see this fucking guy just casually swimming back to where he jumped into the water, not even looking at me. This is by far the scariest moment of my life as I approach the waterfall. Long story short, I go over and I'm underwater for a long time, over a minute. The water above unrelentingly pushing me under. The only reason I survived was there was a large log that had gone over, and I grabbed it and used a leverage against the bottom to push me away from the crushing water. I survived, obviously, but then I had to trek the miles back to my dorm in the dark without my flashlight, every step of the way thinking he would come back to finish the job. The next year, a football player drowned going over that fall. The news said it was because there was an extreme current due to the recent rainfall, but I've always wondered about that. Before I start, here's a bit of context to my story. My husband and I lived in a small 2-floor house with 2 main entrances. One along the front and the other on the side of the house, which opens up into the laundry room. When we're too busy or it's too late to walk our dog, we hook his collar onto a long line that's attached to one of the pipes on the corner of our house so that he could use the bathroom. We used to do this from the door in our laundry room, but we noticed the large step from the door to the ground had been taking a toll on his hips. As a result, we started letting him out through the front door instead, since the porch is much closer to the ground. This particular night, I was home alone with my dog, and it was around midnight when I decided to let him outside one last time before going to bed. I hook him up to his line, close the door, and lock it before heading into the kitchen to put away the dishes. This was pretty routine. Even if he used the bathroom quickly, he liked to walk around along the front and side of the house for a few minutes before coming back inside. As I'm putting away the dishes, I hear a scratch on the door, which is how my dog signals that he wants to come back inside, so I head over to let him back in. Since I've watched way too many scary movies, I always look through the door's peephole before opening the door. Out of habit, I look to check that my dog is in front of the door. Instead, I see a man staring very intently at the door handle. I freeze with my hand on the door handle. I don't know how much time went by, but then I heard another scratch, this one louder than the last. This kind of wakes me up from my initial shock and I run to grab my cell phone. I call my husband to tell him what's happening. He was very confused. I probably wasn't explaining the situation very well, but he says that he's heading home. This is when I realize my dog is still outside with this person. I head back to the front door, trying to make as little noise as possible to check whether the stranger is still there. Just like before, he's standing there, head bowed, looking at the doorknob. I tiptoe over to the laundry room and slowly open the door as quietly as possible. I can't see my dog anywhere and the side of my house is covered in gravel, so I knew I couldn't step outside without making a lot of noise. With my heart still pounding in my chest, I go to the front door to keep an eye on the stranger and to get a better look at him. I considered calling the police, but I didn't feel like they would take me seriously, since all this man was doing was standing in front of my house. I tried taking a picture of him with my cell phone, but my camera was only able to take pictures of the peephole and not the images behind the glass. All of a sudden, the man looks up directly at me. I swear he knew I was there. He glares at me, then opens his mouth to show his taunting, malicious grin. He stood there that way for a few seconds. With that, he turns around and starts to walk down the street. I stay in the same place, almost expecting him to rush back and start pounding on the door. But luckily, my husband got back after a few minutes. Long story short, he convinced me to call the police and we went out looking for our dog. It turns out that this man had cut the end of the line connected to the pipe, and our dog decided that this was a good time for him to explore my neighbor's backyard, which was where we found him. It's been 3 years since this happened, and we've since moved to a new house for unrelated reasons, and the police weren't able to come up with any suspects. Ever since then, we take our dog on very long walks before the sun goes down. This happened in the fall of 1993 when I was 20 years old. In the interest of context, this was before I started college and I was working in the material prep department of a plastics factory on the night shift. I was the only woman in the department and my male coworkers were initially skeptical that I could handle the job. But I proved myself and earned their respect. It was hard work, but on the plus side, it put me in the best shape of my life. It was also about the same time that I dumped my abusive boyfriend. He was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive, as well as an alcoholic. This fact, more than anything, is probably why I got myself into this situation in the first place. I had just gotten off work and it was about 1:30 a.m. My car was practically running on fumes, so I stopped at a local gas station to fill up. While I was pumping gas, a woman about my age approached me looking nervous and scared. She said that she'd been at her boyfriend's house and that they'd gotten into a fight. She said she'd walked to the gas station to use the payphone and call a friend to pick her up. On her way to the station, a car pulled up as she was walking and the guys inside started catcalling and harassing her. With a slight movement of her head, she indicated a car that was parked off to the side by the gas station dumpsters. I saw a large, light green car like a Caddy or Lincoln, with at least 2 or 3 shadowy figures inside. She said they threatened her and that she was too scared to call her friend and wait. The woman was neat, well-dressed, and didn't seem high or drunk or anything like that. She just seemed really nervous and freaked out, so I didn't even hesitate. I finished pumping my gas and told her to hop in the car and that I'd take her home. At that time on a weeknight, there was very little traffic, so I booked it right out of the gas station and asked her where she lived. She kept twisting around in the seat to see if the car was behind us. And when I asked her to put her seatbelt on, she ignored me and kept looking for the car. I assumed she was just scared. A few blocks down the road, however, I noticed she was looking around the car, and she started asking me about money, saying things like, "Where's your purse? Where's your bag? I need money. You need to give me some money." My stomach sank. I have this woman in my car, and now she's gonna rob me. Fuck. But when I thought about it, robbery just didn't make much sense. I was driving a 1985 Chevette, affectionately nicknamed Shitbox, and was wearing my work clothes, a ratty t-shirt and jeans with combat boots. I did not look like a person with a lot of cash, primarily because I wasn't a person with a lot of cash. She twisted around in the seat again and started yelling, "There they are," over and over again. She didn't sound scared anymore. I checked the rear view and sure enough, the light green car is right behind me. She started cackling and bouncing up and down in the seat. "My boys are gonna fuck you up, bitch. They're gonna fuck you up." She's laughing like crazy, opening the glove box, looking in the back for a bag or purse, and telling me all this messed up shit these guys are planning to do to me. Now, if I had been smart, I would have just driven to the police station. Actually, if I had been very smart, I would have just called the cops from the gas station and waited with her until they arrived. That would have been the intelligent thing to do. Unfortunately, none of this crossed my mind until later. In the moment, I just got really fucking angry. I realized 3 key things all at once. 1, there was an intersection up ahead with cars on either side waiting to cross, and the light had just turned yellow. 2, I had a spare box cutter that I kept for work in the driver's side door compartment. 3, the crazy bitch still hadn't put on her seatbelt. I didn't think. I floored it and passed under the yellow light just as it turned red. I glanced back to see if the green car was still behind me, but the cross traffic at the intersection had started to move, and they hadn't caught up. The bitch started yelling. I slammed on the brakes and she hit the dash and windshield with a solid and viciously satisfying crack. When she rebounded to the passenger seat, I had the box cutter in her face and was screaming some seriously bat-crazy shit. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, "Get the fuck out! Get the fuck out of my car before I cut off your face and make you eat it, bitch!" The crazy screaming and box cutter combo worked. She grabbed blindly at the handle and popped the door open, and I started shoving and punching her until she tumbled out of the door to the curb. I stomped on the gas, got to the next turn, and squealed around it with the passenger door still open. I made a few more turns because I was afraid that the green car might catch up to me. After a little while, I stopped to close the passenger door, and then I cut across town and got on the highway to get home. I was only on the highway for about 5 minutes before the shake started. I pulled off to the shoulder to calm down and get my shit together, and then I drove home. I told my older sister, who I had been living with temporarily after the whole breakup thing, everything that happened. She wrapped me in a tight bear hug while simultaneously yelling about how stupid I was for not going to the police. I've never been so glad to be yelled at in my life. To give some explanation and background knowledge for this whole encounter, I was around 15 at the time this occurred. I was camping out in the middle of nowhere with my family and part of my extended family, my aunt, uncle, and cousins. I was the oldest kid there in the RV, so you can probably understand how it felt to have no one else there to do the stupid crap I did back then with. With a good 2-year gap between me and the inferiors, it was almost like nirvana when I got to the campground and met the other teenagers. These were all people we knew fairly well from previous camping trips, so it was considered normal to hit it off with them from the start, and act like we've known each other forever within the hour. Now, this story. So, my parents trusted me a lot. I liked my fun, but I liked getting home in time for dinner equally as much. So when I was gone most of the day with other people from the camp, they didn't think much of it. The only rule was that I had to be back at the RV to eat dinner, and before 8:30 p.m. So picture this, right? Group of 6 teenagers, 15 to 16 years old, out in the middle of the woods with no adult supervision for the vast majority of the day. Just a recipe for success right there. But this particular day, we found a neat little deer trail we hadn't found in the 2 years we'd been there before. On second thought, though, it didn't really seem like a deer trail. It snaked through a really thick part of the underbrush, maybe a foot of clear ground, and 3.5 feet clear of branches going upwards. It's a really hard thing to pick out of the brush, unless you're either really looking or know where it is. It was promptly explored, marked with a broken branch outside of the entrance, and quickly forgotten. Except I remembered this special little tunnel. That night, while we were all eating dinner, one of the adults proposed that we played manhunt out in the woods at night. Not everyone was totally on board with this idea, but in the grand scheme of the plan, they were quashed down like autumn leaves. Everyone got a flashlight, and everyone was assigned to a team. For those of you who aren't sure what manhunt is, here's an explanation. Everyone playing is given a flashlight and they're divided into 2 groups. It's basically like glorified flashlight tag, but there's a catch. As you catch people, you have to correctly identify who they are. And if you can, they join forces with the hunters. The last man standing gets a candy bar or something, whatever is being offered as the prize. That's how we played it anyway. For the first round, I get lumped in with the runners, those who are getting chased by the hunters. We get a 5-minute head start to run, climb a tree, whatever the hell we want to do to evade the hunters. Usually I'm the one up in the tree, but that never really worked out as being the winning spot. So to try and score a win for once, I decide to try what I think will be a surefire method of winning. And the hiding spot was the rude little path through the thicket. It took most of the head start time to find the damn thing because it was so well hidden and out of the way. As I passed hiding spots, I heard hushed, smothered whispering between siblings who were questioning my actions. It should be noted that I have bat hearing, and my ears are possibly my greatest asset in this game. But when I'm just reaching the destination, I hear the short blast of the air horn announcing that the 5 minutes are up. I swan dove into this minute little path in the undergrowth, shuffling on my hands and knees until I'm about halfway in, crouching down like some huge malformed quail. The hunters are doing an initial sweep through the trails looking for obvious hiders and people caught out trying to change spots. When they finally reach me, they reach the dead end and go straight back. I try to readjust myself and crawl further down the tunnel. I honestly don't know how it happened, but I found an even more hidden path within that one. And accidentally I dragged my stupid body down the rabbit hole. Except instead of ending in a dead end, this one ended in a slight hollow. I don't ever want to describe exactly what I found there. I'm sorry, but I just can't. It was a younger looking woman, naked, covered in lacerations and stab wounds in the fetal position. Her glassy, glazed eyes seemed to look straight through me. I won't go any further than that. I was too scared to scream, and I froze there while dark, burgundy stains formed on my jeans. I was sitting there, frozen, and then I heard someone else coming along the path. Have you ever been so scared that for one moment, one insane moment, you truly consider something incredibly stupid as a viable option to escape? That was one of those times. I let out a short, trembling whisper and started moving. Whoever was on the path stopped and then eagerly started moving forward again. I could hear the panting, uneven breaths of a man. A horrible marker of whoever it was getting closer and closer to me by the second. By some wondrous, beautiful miracle, he missed the path leading to the brushy hollow. I heard him moving down past the entrance, dragging something clunky and awkward behind him. I heard clinking noises and the occasional effort to silence the small, sharp noises. I heard a low curse somewhere towards the end of the tunnel, and I blasted out of the undergrowth tunnel like a bullet forcing its way out of a barrel. Cracks, crashes, and obnoxious rustling was all around me as I heard the man sharply intake a breath and begin to move towards me. The deep panting was getting closer and closer to me. I thought I was going to be too slow at exiting, but somehow, I exploded out of the entrance, got onto my wobbly, half-asleep legs, and started booking it down the trail. The unknown pursuer was close behind me for a bit, but it seemed like he was too exhausted to chase me at that same speed for long. I know everyone loves to rip on the fact that people always trip in horror movies, but in all honesty, tripping is something I am amazed I didn't do. With adrenaline coursing through me at the speed of Usain Bolt, trying to keep my jello-like legs to move me away from whoever was behind me was like trying to run on water. It felt like an eternity, but I finally reached the main trail running back to the camp, and sprinted down it screaming bloody murder. Confused faces looked out from the trees, and I think someone called after me. Reaching the camp was easy, but trying to explain why I woke up half the people in the camp and bolted out of the woods at breakneck speed was harder. When I finally choked the words out to explain, I remember a profound, insidious silence throughout the group of adults waiting at the mouth of the trail. I really don't remember a whole lot from that point on. I do know that the cops were called, and my mother and aunt ran shrieking and wailing along the trail, calling for the other kids to come back to safety. When someone's yelling like that, you don't ignore it. They rounded everyone up in 30 seconds flat and barreled back into the camp. The police found a man out in the woods, creeping along the trail, clutching a knife. A black garbage bag with a plethora of sharp objects and a saw was found abandoned on the trail. Some were speckled and smeared with dried blood. I don't think there's really any getting over it. I still have nightmares sometimes. of the man chasing me, breathing heavily down the back of my neck, trying to catch me. Sometimes he succeeds. So, this is a story that happened to my mom's friend in Korea about 10 years ago. Every time I hear this story, I still get the chills. My mom's friend lived in an apartment complex in Seoul, South Korea. She was a stay-at-home mother with a young daughter, and her husband worked during the day. One day, she was coming home from running errands with her daughter and got onto the elevator in her building. When she got on, she noticed that there was a man wearing a cap and a yellow raincoat, and he kept his head low so that she couldn't really see his face. She immediately felt really uneasy, and she made her daughter stand to her side, furthest away from the man. What made her feel even more uncomfortable was that when she pressed the button for her floor, there was no other lit number. And on top of that, she noticed that he was carrying something wrapped inside newspaper close to his side. Things started to click in my mom's friend's head, and she started to panic and decided to take out her cell phone and pretend like she was calling home to her husband, who was obviously really not at home and at work. She started saying things like, "Oh, I'm on the elevator and about to get off. Can you get the door for me?" And making it seem like her husband was waiting for her at home. When the elevator did reach her floor, I think she lived on the 12th floor or something, she quickly got off, grabbed her daughter, and started to walk as fast as she could to her apartment. She noticed that the man also got off on her floor and was slowly following her down the hallway. When my mom's friend got to her door, she started to bang on it and was shouting things like, "Hey, I'm home, please open the door," and kind of pretended like her husband was coming to answer the door. Upon seeing this, the man in the yellow raincoat started to walk away back towards the elevator. When he seemed to be far away enough, my mom's friend quickly picked up her daughter and slid open her door's passcode thing. This is usually how people get into their homes in Korea. And she started to frantically put in her key code. But the problem was that the buttons would make noise, so the man knew that no one was going to answer the door for her. And he turned around and started to run back towards her. My mom's friend, at this point, was practically screaming, and when she finally got her door to open, the first thing she did was throw her daughter in through the door. When she got in herself, she saw that the man was pretty much inches from the door, but she managed to shut it and lock it before he could wedge his hand or a weapon into the door. Afterwards, looking through the door's peephole, she saw that the man was walking away back towards the elevator. Several months later, my mom's friend was watching the news, and there was a coverage on the capture of a serial killer named Yoo Young-chol, who used to kill a lot of prostitutes. She told my mom that she could never forget the dread she felt when she saw the too familiar yellow raincoat and hat that he was wearing when apprehended. So that's the story about how my mom's friend was almost killed by a serial killer. I'll leave his Wikipedia page in the description for anyone who's curious. When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to rural areas of Australia. Basically what you did was tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks where you do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but... Hey everyone, this video contains 5 different kinds of stories. A crazy ex story, a drug story, a night shift story, a taxi story, and a camping story. If you can comment by the end of the video which kind of story you'd like to have an entire video dedicated to so I know what you guys want to see, that would help a ton. I've also left timestamps in the description for each story, so if you've heard a story before and you want to skip it, you're able to. Now, on to the stories. I think this story will be improved by some context about the setting and such, so here we go. First, this took place after I graduated high school and moved away from my family. I moved up to Alaska again, and I say again because I lived there before and attended college there. Second, and very conveniently, my mother had been renting out our old house instead of selling it. I say conveniently because the long-standing residents had moved away and therefore I was awarded the old house. I had to work quite a bit to keep up the payments, but my mother pitched in, thankfully. Third, at the beginning of this story, I should make you aware that I had recently broken up with a girl who had been staying with me in the old house I was renting through my mother. And this breakup was unclean and dysfunctional, much like the relationship itself was. And finally, the story begins. It was winter break, which means I would be spending more time inside than I normally would. It was somewhat lonely in the house, being without a stable girlfriend then. Also, there's no neighbors really to speak of, as the house was in an extremely wooded region a few miles out of town. One late afternoon, soon after I thought the whole breakup predicament had come to a close, I was made quite aware that it wasn't. My cell phone began ringing and ringing from an unknown number. Cliché, I know, and I decided to pick up. It was, of course, my ex. She began telling me about how great her new boyfriend is and how horrible I was and am. The sort of talk that you can almost smell the booze off the caller's breath from miles away. I was actually listening until she decided to hand the phone over to her boyfriend, where he was instead sounding oddly threatening, and I decided to hang up in the most polite manner possible, with a "fuck you and have a nice day." Days later, again with my mind beginning to forget, only this time about the most certainly drunken phone call, I'm laying on the living room couch watching some TV. While laying there, I noticed something quite unsettling. A person standing in the window behind me. How did I notice this, you ask? The reflection from the TV screen is how. I didn't move, not an inch. I had no gun, I had no knife, I had nothing but my wit and my fists. I just lay there, watching the reflection. Eventually, it moved away from the window. That normally wouldn't spook me, but I was taking into account that 1. The house was nowhere near another, so that's a red flag. 2. If someone was just wanting to talk, they'd knock. And 3. I was most certain that it was that boyfriend of hers. Nothing became of that situation, but similar situations continued, such as a car pulling into the driveway and no one getting out and leaving inconspicuously. This was worrisome at the least, but I didn't suspect a true threat. A few days later, I'm laying in bed at night. It was very late and I was getting ready to sleep. I get another call from an unknown number. It's her, but this time she's asking me to come outside and come see her because she wants to deliver an apology. At the time I was thinking, oh, how do I say this? Fuck off. Though I still went outside to see what the deal was. I open the door and of course it's incredibly dark. I say into the phone, "Hey, I'm outside.
Come around back."
With this, I began to walk on the snow-covered ground in the darkness with just my put-on boots. The motion lights turn on as I cross the garage and the driveway. The snow masking the ground is tinted yellow by the light. I round the corner of the garage and turn my phone to see. There's a road that runs behind my house and connects to the driveway by bending, and I make my way towards the road. The snow crunches beneath my boots as I come even closer. There's a part in the trees that allows me to walk straight to the road, otherwise one would have to make his way around the entirety of the driveway, and I reach this part. I ask into the phone, "Where are you?"
"In the car. I see you."
I step onto the road and see her car parked a few dozen feet away from me with the lights dimmed. "So, what's the deal?"
"I just want to talk. Come here."
I approach the car and make my way around to the passenger side, and I finally see her face. She waves me in and I go ahead and oblige, sitting down in the car. I look at her and she says,
"Look, I'm sorry. I know I've been a real bitch lately."
No, it's okay. I really wasn't good to you and I deserve it."
"I don't agree, but..."
Then, of course, she abruptly stops speaking because car lights shine from behind us. Naturally, I assume it's her boyfriend, and by the look on her face, she did too. The car parks behind us, and sure enough, the boyfriend gets out and storms over to my side of the car. He yanks on the door handle and the door swings open and he attempts to grab me, but I grabbed his wrist and got out of the car. "What the fuck do you think you're doing with her, huh?" We were talking and I was about to leave. "Bullshit, you're trying to fucking bang her." Look, I'm trying to sleep and I'm in no mood to do anything. He gave me this look of utter enragement before swinging at me and, of course, missing. A little scuffle ensued, and all that happened was him swearing and eventually slipping and falling before yelling at us both that he was going to fucking kill me and blah blah blah. I just stood by her car as he pulled away. She gave me a lift back to the house and I invited her in and she obliged. It was late in the night and I suggested she lock her car if she was going to stay the night, and she, again, obliged. We slept upstairs in my bed before I awoke hours later. There was a banging at the back door, and I knew this because the back door was directly below my room. She woke up too, whispering, "Oh my God," to herself. I stand up quietly and go to my closet and reach behind the coats that I'll never wear and grab my Louisville Slugger. She was sitting upright in my bed with her hand seemingly embarrassingly covering her eyes. I didn't say anything before walking down the stairs slowly, attempting to be silent. The lights were off and there's no windows on the staircase. The banging on the back door had audibly ceased. I held the bat tightly, making sure it didn't bang into the wall to signal my position at the time. I remember how slowly I stepped down, especially on the bottom 3 steps, which were always the creakiest. Once I reached the last step, I froze, and it still gives me chills to this day. The hardwood floors creak around the bottom of the staircase, and there was a creaking that was growing closer and closer. I raised the bat above my head, ready to slam whoever it was right on top of the head. The creaking grew closer until I could hear it from my side, and I planned to swing it as soon as it was right in front of me. As the staircase opened to the left from the bottom up, I listened very carefully, holding my breath. The creaking came to my northeast and I squeezed my hands tighter than I ever had before around the bat, waiting for it to become just north of me. The floor creaked again. This time they were directly in front of me and I slammed the bat down hard. I hit something hard and whatever it was crumpled to the floor with a bang and a small flash. I turned on the light and there he was, the boyfriend. He had shot his gun directly at the floor and left a hole in the hardwood. My ex came down the stairs and was crying profusely, muttering, "I'm so sorry," over and over again. I called the local police station and 4 cop cars pulled into my driveway along with an ambulance in a matter of minutes. I sat there at the base of the stairs, watching the boyfriend. He was breathing. I could tell from his chest slowly inclining and declining off the floor. I had grabbed what I think was a 9mm off the floor and kept it in my hand with the safety turned on, and I just shook my head over and over in utter disbelief. I explained the situation to police as the paramedics rushed in and carried him out on a stretcher. All in all, I didn't get to sleep until the afternoon later that day after all things had been finished. He ended up actually being induced into a coma and eventually recovered, but a restraining order had already been filed in advance. My ex and I became good friends after the incident and she never dated that guy again. I never ended up moving, though I had considered it heavily, and nothing has since happened. And there you have it. That's my story. This just happened to me a few nights ago and I'm still shaken up, so bear with me. I'm a female bartender at a small cafe that doubles as a venue. During the day we serve coffee and lunch, and at night we have a full bar with bands, comedy shows, etc. On this night, there was an open mic comedy show. Not a lot of comedians showed up, so we ended up closing up shop early and I was ready to go home. I had a patron come in and order a single beer during the comedy show. He was acting nervous, but being a female bartender, I get male customers that are shy or don't want to talk to women, so I didn't think much about it. He sat down, sipped his beer, and watched the show. Since we closed early, everyone was pretty much gone and I wanted to lock up and clean so I could get home. After I escorted the last couple out of the bar and got ready to lock the door, I see the man from earlier walk down the back hallway and into the men's restroom. Not even a minute later, he burst through the door yelling, "Hurry, come back here, I need help." I stood on the opposite end of the hallway and asked him what was wrong. "The toilet is overflowing, there's water all over the floor, help me clean this up." I could tell that something was wrong and I replied, "It's okay man, it happens, I'll mop it up." I'm just trying to close up right now. He continued to argue with me, trying to get me to come into the bathroom with him as I stood about 20 feet away down the hallway. Finally, he walks towards me very aggressively and tries to grab my arm. "You need to come back here now," he says. I immediately put my hands out in front of me so he can't come any closer and tell him he needs to leave. He walks outside and I lock the door behind him. I check the bathroom and it is completely spotless. No water on the floor at all. I flush the toilet and urinal and they're both working fine. I start to get nervous and I take my large pocket knife and clip it to my waistband of my pants, just in case. As I'm cleaning our espresso machine and putting toppers on the liquor bottles, I hear a tapping noise. I look up at the front of the store, which is one big window that has a few curtains covering it. The same man is tapping on the window, waving at me and laughing like a maniac. I watch him walk over to the door and pull on it. It doesn't open since I had locked it after he left. He starts screaming and pounding on the glass saying, "Open the fucking door! I'm going to fucking kill you." Fight overcame flight at this point and I walked around the counter and about 6 feet from the door. I pulled out my knife and locked eyes with him and yelled, "I'm calling the cops, get the fuck out of here." He smiled and walked out of view of the window. At this point, all of my adrenaline just crashed. I locked myself in the office and called 911 crying, explaining that I'm alone and a man tried to lure me into the bathroom and was outside trying to get into my bar. I waited an hour and a half and no police showed up. I called my boyfriend and he drove up to the shop. My manager watched the security cameras from home, making sure that the man didn't come back. I did the deposit and immediately drove home, my boyfriend following close behind me. My male busboy has been coming into work with me so I'm not alone, and the managers have been keeping an eye on the security cameras while I'm working. Have you ever done something so incredibly stupid that it wrecks everything good in your life? This is what happened to me 3.5 years ago. Let me start by saying that I grew up with very little supervision in a shitty household. I'm a male and my 2 sisters and I were basically left to fend for ourselves in an empty house more than half of the time. Needless to say, we grew up quick. I was a junior in high school at the time and despite my upbringing I was relatively well behaved. The worst thing I did was smoke weed, which in today's society isn't that bad. I was out late one night with 3 of my friends. They were all a few years older and 2 of the 3 were dropouts. They weren't my best friends or anything, and honestly, I didn't even really like hanging out with them, but hey, I was an outcast, so I did what I had to do to fit in somewhere. Trip, the most defiant of the group, was a known drug dealer. He was lanky as hell and covered in shitty tattoos. He mostly sold weed, but every once in a while would get his hands on the hard stuff. This particular night, he boasted about a bag of what he said to be coke. It was a pretty small amount, but the quality looked decent. I mean, I knew very little about the shit, but it was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling this story since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To make a long story short, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time that they would have said goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in that area. So the 2 drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under just the light of the stars since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it was getting to be quite late, he ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsings of the story, the female would say that she had felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did, so that wasn't unusual. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again and started walking a bit of the way into the woods when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the serial killer Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the first time that he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time only to watch some guy walk right into the body, and for some reason just turn around and walk away. Coincidence or not, the whole thing really gets you thinking. When I was a teenager, I was home alone one weekend and I was sleeping in my parents' room since there was a TV in there. Sometime around 2 a.m., I felt like I was being stared at from the direction of the hallway. I looked up and I saw a shadow person looking at me. It was weird because it was a pure man-shaped black mass and I could see him in the dark hallway. I'm guessing the light from the TV helped. I sat up and stared back, but I was terrified. We looked at each other for probably 5 seconds and then it turned around and walked down the hall. A few seconds later, I heard a loud crash. I was so scared I turned the TV to the Disney Channel and stayed awake for as long as possible. When I woke up the next morning, I walked down the hall to the bathroom, and that's when I noticed a mirror that was hanging had fallen off the wall and was shattered. My family still doesn't believe me, but I know what happened. When I was 3, my parents moved us into a new neighborhood. The house was nice, but kind of old. The neighborhood was an old 50s tract home area, so it had a pretty varied group of people living there, from older couples that had bought the houses new, to young families looking for a cheap place to live, to poor people looking for cheap houses to rent. As soon as we moved in, my dad started noticing weird things with me. He would hear me giggling and laughing in my room, and whenever he went in and asked me what was so funny, I would tell him that the kids were being funny. He would also come in to wake me up and find me curled up in the closet. This happened over and over again, but my parents didn't think much of it because I was a pretty imaginative kid. The thing that really got to them the most was that I flat out refused to walk out the front door. I would scream and yell and cry until one of my parents carried me in and out of the house. When you walked in the front door, to the right there was a closet and to the left there was a low brick wall that separated the front door from the living room. It was about 4 feet high and about 3 feet long. It was just a room divider, but I never touched it or wanted to be near it. I am an 18-year-old female working the 4 p.m. to midnight shift at a nice, clean gas station convenience store in Canada. Because the location of my workplace is right beside a highway, it is common for people to settle in the parking lot for a while or even stay the entire night. What isn't common is when someone parks right outside the window beside the cash register parallel to the building. It's about 11 p.m. and I'm preparing to close my shift, excited to go home and rest. Keep in mind, I am only 18 and I still live with my parents. A rush of customers comes and goes when I noticed a car parked outside. Right beside the cash register, there is a huge window in order for the workers to look out to see the customers at the pumps. Many people have parked there before, but none have ever parked parallel to the store, snuggled up to the curb like that. Whatever, I thought. Maybe the man or woman is just exhausted. 11:30 rolls around and the car is still parked there. I had to go inside to shut the oil shack, which happened to be right next to where the car was parked. As I close the shack, I look into the car to see the driver's seat reclined all the way back with a man laying back with a smirk on his face. I rushed inside and got behind the counter right as one of my regulars walked in. I pointed out the man in the car, joking that he's waiting for me. The regular seemed worried, telling me to call the cops. He said to stay safe and then left because he had to go to work. I decided against calling the cops because the guy could have easily just been resting after a long day. At around 11:45, I decide to call my sister because the guy was still outside. We live about 15 minutes from my workplace, a perfect amount of time for her to get there in time for closing. I told her the lowdown, which she responded that she was leaving at that moment and that she would be there soon. 11:48, the guy gets out of the car. Well, shit, I'm closing in less than 10 minutes and now he decides he wants a snack? As I watch him, I notice he is walking around near the pumps, staring off into the sky, later to assume he was looking for cameras. 11:50 and he walks into the store, not returning my greeting. He walks right towards the bathrooms. A couple of customers walk in, and because I was busy with them, I assumed the man may have walked out without me knowing. 12:01 and my sister shows up. Thank God. But the car was still parked outside. She comes in and asks what's up, and I ask if he's in the car. She replies no. That's when my heartbeat increased. I looked at the bathroom doors, where both signs, when vacant, the little sign will be green, when occupied and locked, the sign will be red. They were green. When the bathroom lights are on, you can see the glow from underneath the doorway. The lack of the glow made me assume there was no one in either of them because the lights are all motion censored. I told my sister that there was no one in the bathroom, so I began locking the doors and shutting off the lights. My sister, with her balls of steel, opened the women's bathroom, and guess who's sitting on the toilet? She closed the door and begins yelling at him that the store was closing. A couple minutes pass and he's still in there, so she pounds on the door a little bit more. It's about 12:08 now, and the creep comes out of the bathroom, grabs a cookie, buys it, and walks out. He never even looked me in the eye or spoke. He got into his car right away and hurried off. I finished locking up and met my sister at a Tim Hortons nearby. Had my sister not been there, I'm unsure what could have been the outcome. I could have easily not been typing this right now. Thankfully, that day, at the beginning of my shift, I put in my 2 weeks' notice. I had to work the next night, which was uneventful, yet I was still scared to even go outside. After telling my parents, and my mom being a Criminal Minds fan, she thought that the man may have scanned the property for cameras, and went into the bathroom to wait for me to check them during the closing process of the store. He may have parked parallel for a quick getaway. I'm so glad I'm done working there. Go ahead and give me a hard time if you want, but I'm a Mormon. As many know, we have missionaries, men and women, that go door to door in pairs sharing a message. They are sent all over the world. The missionaries assigned to my city are girls. The two in this story were both very pretty, young, maybe 19, 20 years old, and really innocent. Often when they went to teach someone, they would ask my brother or myself to accompany them, just in case. They would usually invite us when they felt uneasy about a person, or if it was a single man, as a safety measure. This day was no different than the others. They asked me and my brother if we would go with them to visit a man named Chuck. They said they had met him at a local park and that he seemed nice enough, but just a little off. We, of course, obliged. They gave us the time and address and asked if we would meet them there. When we got to the address, the girls were waiting for us outside. We walked up the steep driveway to the house. As we approached the door, written in permanent marker on the door itself, was a message. It said something along the lines of, "This is Chuck's house. Please knock. If I don't answer, call this number." We all laughed. Who the hell does that? We knocked and he opened the door. He seemed very out of breath and was breathing heavily. He very enthusiastically invited the girls in. We were about 4 feet behind them, then he noticed us. His tone changed immediately. He said, I thought you two would be coming alone. They answered with a typical, they come with us from time to time. They're our friends type of answer. He gave us an up and down look and said, come on in. It was weird, to say the least. The minute we walk into this dude's house, I felt really weird. This guy's house was immaculate, but the strange thing was, there was no furniture at all. Totally empty. He had 2 bar stools set aside, and that was it. And on every wall in the house was shelving with plants on them. All types of plants, and literally hundreds. Lettuce, spinach, herbs, etc. They were all labeled on the wall in permanent marker. This guy wrote on his walls in marker too? Weird. The girls sat on the bar stools and he sat on the floor. My brother and I stood, and they began their message. About 5 minutes in, he interrupted them. Oh, I forgot I made you girls some drinks. Are you thirsty? They kindly said no, but he insisted. He went to the fridge and got 2 already prepared drinks out. They had this dirty, brown-colored liquid in them. It looked like muddy water. He said that he had made them for them earlier in the day. He didn't have one for him, or for us, just the 2 girls. He handed them the glasses and then just stood there and stared, waiting for them to drink. I immediately felt like this was a bad idea, and I could see that my brother and the girls were equally uncomfortable. They made awkward conversation, and I signaled to them that we should go. They cut themselves short, and we left. He was, well, visibly upset, and kept telling us to come back whenever we wanted. When we got to the driveway, we got in our cars, and I told the girls to come over to my house. At my house, I told them that they probably shouldn't go back, and they agreed. I knew Chuck's last name. It was on his freaking door in Sharpie, for heaven's sake, and I did some quick Googling. Homeboy was released from a police department in California for general reasoning, and was admitted to a psych ward for over a year. They didn't say why, but there was a whole newspaper written up on it. I don't know what his intentions were, but there were way too many weird pieces for me to want to see him again. This story took place in the summer of 2013. My mom and I was 16 at the time, were on a 6-week road trip across the country. During the 4th week of our trip, we found ourselves in New York. At this point in the trip, we were both exhausted from being on the road for so long and from spending far too much time alone together. But we made it all the way across the country, so we weren't giving up on our adventure. One night, we had tickets to the Yankees game. We went, we enjoyed the game, and had a good time. The game was over at around 10 or 10:30. We were staying in New Jersey, so in order to get back to the hotel, we had to take the subway, then walk some distance to Penn Station to take the train back to New Jersey. So we leave the stadium and get to the subway station, along with the thousands of other baseball fans, and luckily we're able to find the right subway and the exit we need to get off without a hitch. We got off the subway and left the subway station and started our walk to the train station. At this point, it was probably close to 11 and there weren't many people walking the streets. Being from the LA area, I'm not new to the big city, but New York City was a new, foreign, exciting place to me. I was walking pretty slow, trying to take in all the sights. I was looking around and I realized we were right across the street from the Empire State Building. I was stoked and I pointed it out to my mom. She, however, did not share my excitement. With a look of sheer terror on her face, she says something through gritted teeth. "Walk faster and hurry up." I was completely oblivious as to what was going on, but because of how scared she looked, I hurried up without question. She then leaned into me and said, "A guy behind you is about to grab your bag. If he does, let him have it and run." I was stupidly wearing a Drawstring Angels backpack, which had been a free giveaway at a baseball game. I know that was a dead giveaway that I was a tourist. Right as my mom said that, I quickly glanced behind me. This huge man was only a few feet back from me and was intently looking me over. He had to have been giant, as I'm 5'8" and he towered over me. I started walking so fast I was almost at a jogging pace. My mom then turned around and looked him square in the eye, and she began walking as fast as me. We were approaching a large intersection, so we started looking around to see if we could yell for help if the guy started to grab me. Much to my relief, there was a cop car parked near the corner. The guy must have seen this too, and he turned the other way at the intersection. When we finally got to the train station, my mom told me she had noticed this man had followed us all the way from the subway station. I got extremely lucky that night with the cop being there, and it served as a good lesson to me. I always pay more attention to my surroundings now. So, I'm a pretty big dude. I'm 5'11" and weigh 245 pounds. I'm rather socially awkward and somewhat careless in most situations. Anyways, on to the story. I was walking along a road with several shops and a patrol station. It's usually busy, but it was 8 p.m. I was listening to music, as I normally do, just on my way to my aunt's house, who lives probably 3 miles away. I had to walk because I'm lazy and can't be bothered to get my driver's license. I look over to my right and I see 4 teenagers. 2 or 3 guys and 1 girl. And I think nothing of it until I cross the street to gain access to a shortcut I feel confident about taking. As I said earlier, I'm socially awkward, so as I pass the alley where they were, I stare at my phone and pretend to be doing something. And that's when a cute girl steps out and says something, but I have my music on so I can't hear her. I take my headphones off and excuse myself, and she says, excuse me, I dropped my bag. Can you get it for me? You look strong enough. It's fallen behind the dumpster. The first thing I thought was, damn, she's cute. But then it occurred to me, A, where have the other people gone? And B, how do you drop a bag behind a dumpster by accident? So I refuse and make up a piss-poor apology that my back has been thrown out and I couldn't help her. And that's when I half smile and apologize again and start walking swiftly. Now, here's where cute gets creepy. Even over my headphones, I hear her just wailing, "Please, oh please, I'll insert active sexual favors here. Please, just get my bag." She then proceeds to walk after me. Again, not bothered by much, but she just went from 0 to 100 quicker than quick, and I fear she might have a mental illness. So I start jogging faster than I ever have before, and I keep looking back. The worst part, she was still walking. Come to the end, I ran 3 miles and never want to walk down by that alley again. I'm very close to my cousin, and she comes to visit me and my grandma sometimes, and we just sit around and talk about what's been going on. This one story scared the shit out of me. At the time, she was working at a retirement community, and that often involved her staying late at night in order to help put the residents to bed and bathe them and such. On this particular night, she decided to get gas and a snack since she had a pretty uneventful ride through lots of abandoned streets that were surrounded by farms and land that was for sale. While she was driving, she noticed a truck turn and begin driving behind her. She thought nothing of it and continued on her way to the gas station as she noticed the truck tailgating her on the empty road. She sped up, and so did the truck. She felt relief as she turned into the gas station parking lot. So did he. She pulled up to the pump and watched. He didn't. He pulled up right behind her, boxing her in with the parked car in front of her. He wasn't anywhere near a pump. She said she knew for sure something was up at that point. So she got out and practically sprinted into the gas station. She grabbed a soda and started looking at the chips, pretending to be indecisive. She snuck a glance outside and noticed a man get out of the truck and come into the store as well. He approached her and said, hey, there's something wrong with your car. Although she was driving a 2008 Honda, she knew very well that there was nothing wrong with it. She decided to prod him to see if he was tricking her. Oh, what's wrong? What? Something's wrong here. If you come outside with me, I'll show you, and I'll even fix it for you. I've got tools in my truck. She felt progressively more uncomfortable, and she nodded, trying to act like she wasn't panicked, looking at the cashier who wasn't paying attention. Oh, you mean the gas cap? She made up something on her feet. Yeah, I know, it's been bothering me. He smiled and nodded excitedly. Oh, yeah, the gas cap. I have the tools you need to fix it. I can help you out. Her heart was racing. Okay, you go get the stuff you need, and I'll meet you out there when I'm done paying for my stuff. He nodded and smiled again as he went back outside and began shuffling around in the passenger side of his truck. She went up to the gas station attendant and said, I need you to call the police. Her cell phone was dead, and she took the gas station phone, calling the police immediately. She detailed everything and watched as the man looked back at her. She said he went pale in the face and got into his truck and hauled ass out of the parking lot. She was terrified that he would be waiting for her up ahead, so they sent a police officer to escort her home. To this day, she can't go to that gas station without anticipating she'll see his truck. My cousin asked me to babysit her children while her husband and her were at work. I didn't mind since I was off and I love spending time with them. I live across the street from a neighborhood park, and if you live in the city, you know the park is extremely populated due to the summer camps they offer. Well, as soon as I walked out the door from my house, my niece noticed my friend, Sophie, was parking her car. She usually comes over on my days off since we hardly hang out because we both have busy schedules. I told her I was headed to the park since the weather was nice and the kids can play outside, so she tagged along. We didn't realize how hot it was until we were there for about an hour, so I thought it was time for us to go. We were making our way to the water fountain when I looked up and noticed a man holding his camera. He looked about 60 years old and like your typical tourist. He had a sun hat, map tucked into his pocket, backpack, and camera case. The guy was busy taking pictures of a couple kids from the summer camp program. I know from working in events and photography that if you're trying to take pictures of children, you have to have the consent of their guardian because you don't want to look like a creeper. The camp counselors noticed the guy as well and were talking amongst themselves to see who was going to go talk to the guy. None of them did. Since the guy figured out that he was being watched, he gathered his things quickly and tried to walk away. I knew it was wrong and I told my friend to watch my niece and nephew. I walked up to the guy and I informed him that he wasn't supposed to take pictures of children without their parents' consent. He said he wasn't taking pictures of anyone but of the scenery. I called out his bullshit and asked him to show me the pictures. He became extremely nervous and said no. He left me no choice but to call the police. As I've said before, due to it being summer, the parks were populated. There's a lot of foot and car patrols. It only took less than a minute for the nearest officer to come. I told him the situation and he asked the guy to delete the pictures. The guy started to argue with the officer, but he couldn't win since the camp counselors didn't give consent. The guy finally, willingly, gave the officer his camera and reviewed the pictures. This guy was taking pictures of the kids, but he zoomed into their private areas and faces. The officer kept going through the pictures and discovered older pictures of children like this, but close up. He was arrested and they took my statement and the counselors. It made me sick to my stomach to know that happened while I was there with my 6-year-old niece and 1-year-old nephew. I hope he gets what he deserves. Working alone is scary. Working alone as an 18-year-old girl at a full-service gas station in a scummy part of my town on the night shift by myself is even worse. Let me tell you a little about this station first off. It was one of the first gas stations opened up for a local company, and they were keeping it open for nostalgia's sake. This means that it was all much older equipment, like no credit card slots at the gas pump, ancient cash register, no cameras, etc. And we were to work in this little glass box of a store of which we sold no product in. This was solely a place where my job was to go outside and pump people's gas. And for the year that I worked there, since it was an inconvenient location, I only got about 10 customers per night. I was kinda paid to sit and do my homework or read. This one night in particular was going fine. It was nearly the end of my shift and I was reading an exciting part of my book. Then, I look up from my reading to see a man stumbling towards the glass door. The sight of him makes my heart stop and I silently thank my dad for his suggestion to keep the door locked at night. This obviously drunk man reaches the storefront and automatically pulls at the door to walk in as he approaches. He grabs at it a few more times when he finds that he cannot open it. I, at this point, stand up and go over to the door. And keeping it friendly, I ask, "Hello, is there anything I can help you with?" Talking with the door closed, of course. The man replies in a slurred voice, "I need help. I've lost my wife. She was just with me a moment ago. I don't know where she's gone." And he covers his face with his hands and makes the most fake attempt at sobbing I have ever seen. Then makes eerie, tearless eye contact with me when I start speaking. "I'm sorry, would you like me to call the police for you?" No, I don't know where my wife is." And then he does the whole covering his face, fake crying thing again. "All I want is some comforting. Can I sit down with you for a while? I just need to talk." He gives me an intense look and smiles. "I'll call the police for you if you need. I'm sorry, I really can't help you." Alright, at this point I'm scared shitless. I'm keeping my tone controlled and hoping with every fiber of my being that he will just go away and not try to break in. I have a knife in my pocket and I'm wondering to myself if I would actually have the nerve to stab him if it came down to it. The man proceeds to plead to let him into the store. I firmly say no, and after a few minutes he goes off, still muttering about losing his wife, casting glances back at me the whole walk back to the street. I then call my parents and have them come down immediately so to watch out for me as I count the money to cash out. I had a lot of weird stories stem from this job, but this was the time I think I felt most in danger. My story happened about 4 years ago. I was a single mom living alone and my property is out of town a bit. Not in the middle of nowhere, but not close enough to town for walking distance either. I have a couple of neighbors that I see from time to time and everyone in my area knows everyone else, pretty much. This happened when I was up late one night. I was doing some dishes and cleaning up because my son was in bed for the night. I had let my dog outside to roam the property. I have quite a large field to one side of my house that my dog, Goldie, loves to play and run around in, and I was just humming along with the radio and washing dishes. I go outside to call my dog to the house. She roams to the far end of the property, and it's pretty normal for me to have to call her a few times before she bounds up the yard. And I see a small light in the field that I have never seen before. It looked very much like a flashlight. I was a little creeped out, so I stayed in the lights of my property where my neighbor across the street could see me if he looked out, and it made me feel safer. Whether it was justified or not, I don't know. I called Goldie 3 times, shouting loud because I didn't want to walk into the dark to find her. I waited a few minutes, listening for her paws thumping on the ground, and I did. I also heard a faint male voice from the direction of the light calling my dog back into the field. At this point I can see her. She's about halfway between me and the source of the light. I'm getting freaked out, but I also have weapons in my house and a knife on me at all times, and I'm not about to let this fucker hurt my Goldie or myself. I shout at the dog, "Goldie, you get your little butt over here right now." At this point she realized I was serious and wiggled her little butt over to me, and I rushed into the house with her. I stayed in the house and turned the lights off so that I could see out without people necessarily seeing me inside. I retrieved my handgun from the safe and loaded it and kept it with me as I checked the doors and windows to make sure they were locked, and I looked out the window on the side of the house to see if the light was still there. I didn't see it when I looked out the window. About 10 minutes had passed at this point since I got in the house. So I put on a low light in the kitchen and started doing dishes again, this time with my gun on the counter next to me just in case. About 30 minutes pass and I'm just starting to reach a level of calm when I hear a very loud crash in my garage. Now, in my area, the neighbors look out for me and I look out for them. So at this point, I went into the living room and called the neighbors across the street to ask him if he will look out his front window and see if there's anyone outside near my garage. I tell him that I'm going to hit the lights in the garage and push the button in the laundry room to open the door. He agrees and seems super concerned. So I creep to the laundry room door that leads into the garage and push the button on the inside of the door. The door opening triggers the garage light to come on. My neighbor immediately freaks the hell out. He tells me there is a man in my garage. At this point, I'm just inside from the garage and I have a gun in my hand, so I open the door fast. There is a guy in my garage trying really hard and very stupidly to hide by the side of my car. I slowly start to walk around and have my weapon aimed and ready to fire. As I walk around the car, I say, "I know you're over there, and I have a loaded weapon. You are trespassing on private property. This is my residence, and if you don't leave, I will be forced to shoot you." Like a flash, this guy gets up and sprints out of my garage like a cat with its ass on fire, shouting, "I'm just a friendly neighbor." After that, I closed up the garage and checked to see if anything was missing. It wasn't. I found the toolbox he had accidentally knocked over that caused the crash, and it seemed like his clumsiness got him caught before he could snatch any of my things. I notified the police that there was a man in the area who had broken into my garage. From what I saw, he found a way to wedge the small garage window open and squeeze in, and they came out, asked a few questions, and left. I heard about a guy being picked up for the same type of thing a few days later in a nearby area, but I'm not sure if it was him. This happened around 3.5 years ago. Names have been changed. I was in my second trimester of my pregnancy, and my husband Tom and I were on a 2 a.m. craving trip to Walmart. When we got there, everything seemed normal. My husband walked over to the movie section while I rushed to get my snack, Pringles and chocolate pudding. I'm pregnant, leave me alone. As I was walking down the chip aisle, a man walked up to me. He was in his mid-late 30s, tall, and wore a leather jacket. He looked me up and down with an almost sinister smile and asked how far along I was. I was cranky, hormonal, and slightly creeped out, so I told him it was rude to assume a woman was pregnant because of the size of her stomach. Also, my pregnancy was none of his business. I shouldn't have done that. He seemed annoyed and walked away. I grabbed my things and went to meet up with Tom. The man kept showing up and just stared at me from the end of each aisle. I started to feel really uneasy and whispered about the man to Tom. He brushed it off and said, "I'm sure he's just mad that you called him out." We went to check out and I looked around. The man was in the next lane over with a single pack of gum. We walked outside and loaded everything into the car. I noticed the man stepping into a big red truck about 2 rows down. Tom started the car and we headed home. The truck wasn't far behind. I told Tom I thought he was following us and saw he looked like he was concentrating very hard. Without warning, he made a hard left. The truck followed, hard right. The truck was still behind us. I started to freak out. We kept driving in zigzags with the truck following each time. Finally, my husband pulled into a gas station. The truck pulled in and put his car into park. He started to get out of the car. We waited until he was walking up to my window. He was about 5 feet away when Tom suddenly took off. We went down several roads to make sure we lost the guy and finally went home. I was so thankful to Tom for keeping a clear head and coming up with a good plan to get me away from that creep. He's my hero. I was 12 when this happened. Usually my younger brother, who would have been 10 at that point, and I would walk home from the bus stop after school. Both of our parents worked and we would spend a few hours home alone together before my mother got home from the senior center she was working for. We did fine on our own, and by then I knew how to cook safely, how to keep the house locked up, and the neighbors usually kept an eye out for anyone near the property, etc. Normally, my little brother would be a bit ahead of me and make it to the house first, but this particular day, he had taken the bus to a friend's house. I walked home and into the house and went straight to the bathroom, as was my daily routine after school. After washing my hands, I moved into the kitchen to find a snack. At this point, it hadn't even occurred to me that I didn't have to use the key to open my front door. The house was always locked when I got home. The only excuse I can make for this is that I was a teenager and I was just glad to be out of school. So, completely oblivious, I make myself a sandwich and sit down at the kitchen table to eat. A couple minutes pass, I'm feeling pretty damn good to be home and enjoying my ham and cheese when I hear a noise at the back of the house. It sounds like a couple of footsteps. At this point, I start to freak out a bit and try to remember if the door was locked when I came in or not. I couldn't remember. I begin making my way slowly towards the back of the house where the sound is coming from. I hear it again, a couple of shuffling steps, and then silence. There's someone in the back bedroom, which is my room, moving around. I sit completely still for a few seconds, trying not to make any noise to alert the intruder or let them know that a 12-year-old is home alone in the house. I hear the footsteps again. Whoever this person is, they didn't sound like they were in a hurry, so I figured they must not have realized I was there yet. I carefully made my way out into the yard. I ran as soon as my feet were off the porch and got one of the neighbors to come back over with me. He was a friend of the family that lived really close and kept an eye on our place a lot of the time. He tells me to go into his yard and wait there. I have a clear view of my house from his yard, and he tells me to call 911 if he isn't back outside within 5 minutes. I waited in his yard for probably 2 minutes before I started thinking that he must be dead or dying or something, and I was debating on whether or not to call the cops when my neighbor comes out of my front door with some guy I've never seen before. He has this guy's arms behind his back and is holding him. He shouts at me to call the cops, and I do, telling them what happened. They showed up, and they took the guy away. Turns out, he was wanted in another county for breaking into multiple houses while people were away at work, vacation, that sort of thing. I'm just glad it all turned out well. So this happened to my mom 21 years ago when my brother and I were only kids. We used to live pretty far out of town, like a 5-minute drive, which doesn't sound like much, but it was far out enough to not get many visitors unless they were invited. She moved to this little house because she was only after getting a divorce from my dad, and the guy that owned the house she was renting felt sorry for her and gave her a really good price for the rent, so she didn't mind that it was a tiny house in the middle of nowhere. So one night, this guy calls at the house and knocks at the front door, so my mom goes to answer it. In our town, your mind doesn't just instantly jump to the worst case scenario. This young guy, mid-20s, at the door was covered in blood, dirt, and completely out of breath. He asked my mom if he could use the phone and said he hit an animal with his car and he needed a taxi. My mom said, "No, sorry, go somewhere else." At this point, he stuck his foot in the door and said, "Can I use your phone?" I should point out that my uncle, 6'3", fairly big, was out with my mom at the time fixing something in the kitchen. He came to the front door, saw the guy, told him to fuck off, followed after the guy to the road, and watched as he jumped into a nearby field and just started running. He decided to stay the night just in case the guy came back. The next morning, when my mom was about to take my brother and I to school, the police showed up and wouldn't let my mom leave the house. It turns out the guy was arrested after brutally killing a young 11-year-old, just shortly before calling at our house, I assume. It still kinda freaks me out to this day. What would have happened if my uncle hadn't been there that night? I'll leave the link to the news story in the description. I was about 11 years old at the time and I was home alone on a school day. I had begged my father the night before to let me skip school, and I was not in the mood to sit through 8 hours of class. So, I faked being sick and my father allowed me to stay home. My aunt was at work, so I had the house to myself. So, in all of this together, I got to spend a school day in my 3-story house, all by myself, at 11 years old. I thought I was the boss. It was around 10:30 in the morning when I was suddenly awoken by a commotion downstairs. Me being a naive, incoherent 11-year-old, I thought, hey, my aunt stopped by during her lunch break. Cool. So I turned back over and for the next 5 minutes I attempted to fall back asleep. But the noise continued. So begrudgingly I yawned and arose from my bed to go downstairs and greet her. But I needed to go to the bathroom first. Rubbing the crust from my eyes, I practically sleptwalked to the bathroom. I did my business, then, as soon as I flushed the toilet, I heard what sounded like someone take off downstairs. Like, it legit sounded like someone ran into the door rushing to get out of there. That woke me up. It was then that I completely turned into a horror movie cliche. I became the exact person who I, upon seeing on television, would curse out and throw popcorn at. I quietly went downstairs to check out what the hell was going on. I think I knew something was wrong, but being the idiot that I was, I still wanted to see what that noise was. So I got to the 2nd floor landing and creeped around the corner to look downstairs and saw the back door wide open. And I froze. Like I actually froze for a solid 25, maybe 30 seconds. And then it started to click. I went from confusion to fear. My heart rate picked up, my breath shortened, my eyes started to well up. Then I took off upstairs into my room, locked myself in, and barricaded myself in by shoving my bed in front of my door. I hid behind the opposite side of the bed and practically had a mini panic attack before searching for my phone and calling my dad. I know, not even 911 first. Jesus Christ, I was fucking stupid. Upon picking up, I quietly asked whether he came over. No, he was at work. Did he know if my cousin's husband stopped by? No, not that he knew of. Why? I told him and he practically blew up. Call the police. I stayed in that spot behind my bed until the cops came. According to them, the thief was only able to grab a laptop and a few other things before, they think, he took off after hearing me upstairs. After that, my dad installed a security system and changed all the locks. Back then, it never really hit me the severity of what had happened. But now, 12 years later, I realize how fucking stupid I was and how I made a shit ton of mistakes that could have cost me. The thing that frightens me the most, though, is the fact that whoever it was probably knew my aunt and I's schedule so well that they were brazen enough to break in the morning. And here's the reason I think this. Our neighborhood is nice, the houses aren't super spread out, and it never screamed, "Hey, rob me, this house is an easy target." I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking. Whatever. Although I never actually came in contact with the person, it still scared the shit out of me. And every so often I can't help but look back and wonder, what if I hadn't had to use the bathroom? It has been speculated amongst my family that the robber could have been one of my cousins that has had a few brush-ins with the law, but we never found out. Hey everyone, this video was a re-narrated compilation of old stories that were on some of my old taken down videos. I decided to do this video because looking back on my old videos that included some of these stories, some of them only had around 20,000 views. I have 105,000 subscribers right now, so that's over 80,000 people that haven't seen some of these. I hope you all enjoyed the video and could understand this. Thank you all for your constant support. Don't forget to send your own personal stories into corpsehusbandstories@gmail.com. It's also in the description. I plan on making a 100k subscribers thank you video when I get some more recording time, but I figured you'd all rather an actual story video over a thank you video. I plan on doing a giveaway for the 100k video. I'm just not sure what to give away yet. It all happened really fast. Anyways, that's about it. Thank you all so much, and see you in the next video with some fresh stories. In 2008, I worked at a retail clothing store with my girlfriend Chelsea. We were both 18 years old and we tried to work as many shifts together as possible to maximize our time together because she was still in school. My grandfather had recently purchased a Dodge Sprinter van for his business and my car was being serviced overnight, so I got to drive the van. Chelsea and I loved the nights we got to take the van. Because it usually had the back seats installed and the tinted windows meant we could have some privacy, which is great for teens who still live at home. That night, we only had one row of seats in the back, just behind the driver and passenger. Chelsea and I parked near each other like we always did and worked our evening shift, closing the store with a few of our co-workers. We all leave together and I help the manager lock up because the glass doors need to be aligned properly for the lock to engage. It's early March in Pennsylvania and it's still very cold outside, so Chelsea usually starts her car to warm it up and then sits with me as my car warms up. When I get to the vehicles, her car is idling and she's already in the van. I don't even realize that I still have the keys and I never unlocked the doors. She sits with me, chatting for a while. She then sits on my lap and we kiss in the front seats, but we decide it's too late and too cold to have a little fun in the back. Every night we drive home separately from work while talking on the phone. She usually gets home first and I stay on the line while she walks up her long driveway in the dark. That night, I made it home first for some reason, and I knew I had a lot of stuff to carry in, so when I'm close to home, I tell her that I'll call her in a little bit. She asked me to stay on the line because she's almost home and she doesn't like walking past the dark bushes next to her driveway. I stay on the phone and fumble with all of my things I'm carrying out of the van. I know I locked and armed the van because as I was using the key fob to lock the vehicle, I dropped a few things while struggling to keep the phone to my ear. The motion lights have illuminated the whole area, so I'm able to see everything that I dropped. We both make it inside safely, and we also decide not to stay on the phone because she had school in the morning. I begin to doze off almost immediately in my bedroom. I lived with my grandparents who built a house to accommodate for my grandfather's aging parents suffering from Alzheimer's, my great-grandparents, so that they didn't have to go into a home. The driveway runs parallel to a daylight basement that has 2 garage doors, an entrance door, and the French doors to my bedroom. I'm falling asleep as all of the motion lights finally turn off and now my room is completely dark. It wasn't even 20 minutes later when I'm jarred awake by the alarm sirens of the van. All of the motion lights are on and the flashing lights of the van's alarm are filling my room. I left the key fob upstairs in the main part of the house, so I run upstairs to silence the alarm. In the kitchen, as I'm grabbing the fob, my grandfather in his boxers, my great-grandmother in her nightgown, and I in my boxer briefs all meet in the dark. My grandfather grunts as he sees me grabbing the fob, but what my granny said sent shivers down my spine. She basically asked why the hell I was running around outside at this time of night. I wasn't outside. I explained that I was sleeping and she insisted that I was outside making the van alarm. My great-grandparents' bedroom sits above the garage doors looking down over the driveway and the van. I'm assuming she's confused, she has Alzheimer's after all. The goosebumps from her exclamation prompted me to grab a knife from the butcher block anyway, and my grandfather followed with a baseball bat. We both walk outside warily, in our boxers, in the cold but highly illuminated and loud dead of night. The van is still going crazy. The interior lights are all flashing, and I remember that specifically because I'd never seen a car alarm do that. We silence the alarm and start looking around. My grandfather says he thinks a deer may have run out of the woods in the dark and hit the van. I don't say anything as we investigate. When I reach the back of the van, I notice the door is wide open. That explains the alarm. The van has a feature that if the vehicle alarm is armed and a door is open somehow from inside or outside, it alarms. But how? I locked it and armed it, hence the blaring alarm. That's when I realized the door was opened from the inside. My blood ran cold. The door is open so the inside lights are still on. I see the empty space behind the row of seats and there are wadded up napkins and a chip bag. They weren't ours. Someone was in the van with me the entire time. I must have left the van unlocked by mistake when I went into work, and that's how Chelsea was able to get into the van without the keys at the end of the night. Was it a homeless person escaping the cold, or someone with a more sinister intent? What if I had gotten off the phone like I wanted to? If they had bad intentions, the fact that I was on the phone might have saved my life, because Chelsea would have raised hell if she heard me being attacked. I get chills every time I think about it. We didn't call the police because my grandfather was skeptical of my conclusion, but my gut tells me that I didn't drive home alone that night. When I was 11, my family of 6 decided to make the move from suburbia to a lovely rural bungalow. I have 3 sisters, aged 9, 12, and 18 at the time. We were all excited for the privacy and isolation of our new home. For once in our lives, we would have no neighbors and a large yard to play in. Our home had large picture windows giving us a beautiful view of the farmland around us. My parents dislike curtains because there were no neighbors and they collect dust, so we all figured, what's the point? The summer was so much fun there. Every morning I would get up and take my dog for a walk around the woods in our backyard. I absolutely adored the feeling of being alone and was enjoying the freedom of all of our new space. Fall eventually rolled around and I continued my routine of walking my dog both in the morning and after school. I remember one morning while walking my dog I began to feel uncomfortable. I was alone in the woods, there was no one around, but I still felt as though I was being watched. I had shivers down my back the entire walk, and for an 11-year-old, I just felt really strange. My dog was acting weird too. I kept trying to go farther into the woods, but she kept trying to pull me towards our shed. The shed rested at the very back of our yard, on the edge of the woods, where the trees thin out quite a bit. I didn't like how I was feeling, so I took my dog and brought her back to the house and went on with my day. Days went by and I just couldn't seem to shake this feeling of being watched, especially when I was in my bedroom, which had a huge window in it that overlooked our backyard. The view of the woods that I had previously loved was beginning to scare me. I assumed it was just because it was fall and the forest started looking kind of gloomy, I guess. I started having nightmares about waking up in the middle of the night and seeing the figure of a man in our backyard. Weird things kept happening around our house. We all suddenly noticed that we were eating things like bread a lot quicker. Every morning, half a loaf of bread would be gone, and my parents attributed this to their hungry, growing children. One evening, I woke up and heard noises coming from our family kitchen, which was just down the hall from my bedroom. It sounded like someone had come home and I assumed it was my oldest sister. The only thing that was strange was her footsteps sounded a lot heavier than they usually do. The noise stopped very quickly and I was able to fall back asleep. In the morning, my mom asked me and my 2 sisters, the 9-year-old and the 12-year-old ones, if we woke up last night to make food. We all said no, and then I asked if it was my oldest sister. My mom told me that she stayed at her friend's house last night and then thought it was probably the dog making noise. I knew better than that though. I was terrified. I knew I heard unfamiliar footsteps. That night I had a lot of trouble sleeping. I still felt like someone was watching me. Eventually, I had fallen asleep but woke up around 2:30 a.m. I heard noises in the house again. It was the same footsteps I had heard before. I stayed in my bed and felt paralyzed. I rolled over and faced the window, hoping that if someone came in my room, they'd think I was asleep. The noises stopped and I closed my eyes as hard as I could. I told myself I was just imagining things and that monsters aren't real. About an hour must have gone by and I eventually opened my eyes. When I looked out the window, I swear to God, I could see a man standing in our backyard watching our house. Here's a photo that contains a cheesy edit of where I saw him. I was terrified enough that I didn't move at all and eventually fell asleep again. I was so relieved to wake up alive that morning, but was still terrified of our backyard. I ran into the kitchen to tell my mom what I saw and refused to walk the dog. I'm not sure if she really believed me at the time or thought I was having night terror hallucinations, which I did have quite often when I was younger. I went to school that morning. I was anxious all day. The last thing I wanted to do was go home. When I did get home, I saw police vehicles surrounding the house. They had the dogs with them and were searching our yard. They told us a man who had broken into another home had beaten the couple living there and was suspected of being on our property. He stole their wallets, photos, and other small items of value. The biggest thing he stole was their car, which had been ditched 10 kilometers from our home. While searching our property, they found all the items from his previous break-in hidden around our yard. They also discovered that he had been hiding in our shed since his previous break-in. They said he had done this at the previous home prior to breaking in. He would spend time watching the house and observing the residents' routine until he knew it well enough to start coming inside the house. They said he had a long history of premeditated violence, including child abuse, and they believed he was planning on eventually harming us. In the shed, they found wrappers, empty cans of food, and scraps. They told us he was definitely coming into our house for food at night. From the shed, he had a perfect view of our home and could see when we all went to bed. Although they searched our house and property with the dogs, they didn't find him. After that day, I realized that if you feel like you're being watched, you probably are. The writer of this story's first language isn't English, so cut them some slack on the word choice. One night, I stayed at my campus until late at night. It was about 1 a.m. in the morning that I decided to go home. On the front gate of my campus, there was no public transport left, so I had to take the one that's farther away, and I needed to walk for 10 minutes before I got there. The path which I had to take has no street lights, so it was dark. In the middle of my path, there was a woman who I knew about. She lived near my boarding house. I've seen her around the area a couple times. It seemed like we were going the same way. I didn't really think much about it at first, but then she looked over her shoulder and she walked a bit faster. The next thing I know, I was left alone there. After I finally arrived at the main street, there was a bus parked at the side of the street waiting for people to board it. As soon as I got onto the bus, I noticed that the same woman as before was on the bus too. She looked terrified when she saw me, and then she changed seats, moving further away from me. I then realized that she probably thought I was a stalker. It was funny for me until I realized that I would get off the bus at the same time as her, and she might really think that I was stalking her then. I was confused. After all, what could I do? Should I try to talk to her and say, hey, I might be big and scary, but I'm just a normal college boy who lives in the boarding house near your house? But that would be awkward, so I decided not to. Finally, I get off the bus, and yes, she got off there too, of fucking course. My boarding house is located in a private housing complex. To get there, I need to walk in a small alley first. That night, the alley was very dark, and that woman was running in a hurry towards the alley because she thought I was after her. I walked slowly, thinking that if she didn't see me right behind her, she might feel safe and let all of this go. I was very wrong, because just when I was about to go in the housing complex, there she was, looking terrified and started screaming at me. I really didn't know what to do, so I just approached her and told her to calm down. I was right about to explain everything when she took out a kitchen knife from her bag. The situation intensifies quickly. I jumped back and told her that I am not a stalker. She didn't believe me and came at me with a knife. I was about to run when a boy who lives in the same boarding house as me passed us. He obviously knew something wasn't right, so he approached us. He told the woman, who was confused as fuck, that I live in the boarding house. I then apologized to her, but she was still upset and left, still looking at us with her judging eyes when she walked out. I made sure she was already far from me when I finally thanked the guy who saved me and told him everything. He laughed at me, but I couldn't laugh. I just had a knife swung at me and it scared me. So yeah, the woman who lives near me, I'm not a stalker, and I have no intention to stalk you whatsoever. So please don't think about me as a bad guy who followed you home the other night. I'm a college-age male in my first semester of freshman year at a state university. Less than half an hour ago, I was coming back from breakfast when another student who I've never met before started following me. He was maybe 25-30 feet behind me, far enough away as to not be in my general vicinity, so I thought nothing of it. I get to the entrance doors of my dorm and swipe my keycard. The dorms are protected by a scanner, allowing me to access the building. As a quick disclaimer, my back has been bothering me the last week or so. I could barely get the door open for me to get through without a spike of pain shooting up my spine. The only reason I was up and at 'em today was because a midterm was due. I would have held the door open for the guy, but it hurt to even hold it open. And he was quite a ways away and was unlikely to speed up, so I didn't want to be in pain for that long. Dick move, I know, and evidently he thought so too, because as I let it shut behind me, I could see in the window to my right his reflection, his head lurching forward and eyes widening in a, "Really? You really just did that? You asshole," kind of look. I sighed and got ready to apologize as he came in behind me, still moving down the hall because I needed to get back to my room to pack for class. He came in and didn't say a word, at which I thought, fair enough, but I did notice that he was picking up his pace. The way the entry hallway of our building is set up, there's the entry doors at either side which feed into the lobby, where there's doors on the left to the RA's office, the right to the dorm lounge, and the stairs straight ahead. I head toward the stairs straight ahead, expecting to hear the door to the lounge being perhaps somewhat angrily jerked open. But nope, these faster footsteps are coming with me up the stairs. I was at the landing halfway up the stairs, as I live on the second floor, when he got to the stairs. I saw that he was skipping 2 or 3 stairs at a time, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw he was looking at me. Glaring, even. I decided to pick up my pace a little. As I got to the top of the stairs and made a left to get to the door to my hall, he, almost at the top of the stairs, said in a rather confrontational tone, "Hey, pal, wanna talk for a minute?" Between the embarrassment, the aggression to his movements, and anger in his voice, added on to the pain in my back, slowing me down to more of a speed limp than anything, I quickly muttered a "sorry" and made sure to get on the other side of the door as fast as possible. He wasn't taking it though, and when I began to speed walk down my hall back to my room, I heard that door slam open behind me. It was one of those ones that had the press bar to open, and I could tell he'd angrily shoved it. I basically went to a full run and heard him shout, "Hey bro, come back, I just want to teach you some manners." Thank fuck I'd had that head start on him, because I managed to get to my room, unlock the door, get in, and slam it just as he got to it. I relocked the door and held my weight against it just to be safe as he pounded on it with his fists and yelled, "Come on man, I just want to teach you some manners, you fat fucking prick. I thought we were bros, man. What, you just gonna fucking hide in there?" Our hallway was used to people being rowdy, obnoxious, and loud at all hours because I guess that's who they let into honors nowadays. Not to mention most of them were at class anyway, so nobody came into the hall to call this guy on his bullshit. I threatened to call the campus PD or the RAs to haul this guy away, and I think he got the message because I can't hear him out there anymore, nor can I see him through the peephole. What concerns me is that he lives in our dorm, because our security keycards only work on the buildings we live in, and he knows where my room is. I'm really hoping I never meet him again. This story is told from a female's perspective. My New Year resolution 2012 was to get into shape again. After my first kid was born, I had lost my athletic interest, but I had every intention of getting it back. So I started running 4 days a week with my friend Hannah, who is a great runner and motivator. We would run after work 5, maybe 10 kilometers, usually favoring the forest trail. It's the kind of trail that has lighting in the darker months of the year, so you can run there anytime, really. Once you turn on the lights, you have 45 minutes to run the shorter trails and longer to run the longer trails. Then the lights shut off automatically. We had been running for about 2 months when we started seeing the same man hanging around the parking lot every time we got there. Thin man, 25, 30 years of age, always dressed in sports clothes but never actually running. He never looked you in the eye either. We speculated that he could be homeless camping nearby because he was constantly there. We got used to seeing him, sitting somewhere close by, silently and always on his own. We felt sorry for him. He never seemed to talk to anyone or interact at all. But there was something about him that made us hesitate to talk to him or ask if he was okay. I can't pinpoint what it was, but something wasn't completely right about him. One evening, Hannah didn't make it to our run and I decided to go on my own. I arrived at the parking lot, my car being the only car there. I did some stretching, turned on the lights, and set off on the 5-kilometer trail. I hadn't seen the thin, silent man when I started my run. Perhaps it was getting too cold to sit there now that it was autumn, dark, and getting closer to the freezing point. He must have been there, though, somewhere in the shadows, because when I got to the top of the first steep hill, I could hear heavy breathing somewhere behind me. I look over my shoulder and I see him. He's running like a man obsessed, in regular shoes, not running shoes, with his arms moving in a really strange, stiff manner as if he was made of metal, his hands like arrows straight in an upward angle. Sort of like a sprinter, but more extreme, moving like a robot. For the first time, he looked me straight in the eyes, and it was the eyes of a predatory animal, and it made my heart freeze. He had never done anything to harm me, or anyone else as far as I knew, but the look in his eyes alone was enough to let me know that I was facing a serious, serious threat. I started running faster, trying to create distance between us, and I could hear his heavy breathing getting more and more strained. I ran like my life depended on it, adrenaline pumping through my body and giving me new strength. I tore off my necklace and threw it on the ground, thinking, I must leave a trace if he takes me. Something must be left behind. I tried screaming, hoping that someone would be close enough to hear me, but I couldn't scream my lungs out and keep up the pace at the same time. Why is he doing this? What does he want? Who is he? I thought as I started to feel my lungs burn. Then I thought of my 15-month-old daughter and ran until I could taste blood in my mouth. He was still behind me, maybe 100 meters behind me now, but I figured that if I trip and fall, or run out of energy, or fumble with the car keys once I reach the parking lot, then I'm screwed. So once I reached the sharp turn on the trail, I went off the trail and ran straight into the dark woods. I ran only a short distance and then I laid down flat on my stomach, my hand searching for a rock to defend myself with if he found me. I realized that I was wearing bright running clothes with reflectors and neon coloring. I had never felt so visible in the dark before. I could hear him reach the turn and, thank God, he kept on running. I started to slowly, and as silently as possible, move further into the darkness. My heart sank again as soon as I heard rapid footsteps closing in from the trail. He had realized that I must have gone off the trail once he saw that there was no sign of me ahead. He stopped, and I stopped. I could imagine him listening for any sound, and I held my breath and begged a God I don't believe in to make him go away. After a while, I heard him say something in a language I didn't recognize and he walked off. I didn't move. I feared that he would wait for me by the car and realized that I had to get off the trail and onto the main road and stop someone. I couldn't go back to the parking lot. I started to make my way further into the woods, knowing that I would eventually end up on the last part of the long trail and close to the main road. The lights on the trail suddenly shut off. That made me calmer at first. The dark was a comfort and protection. But then, after only a few moments, it switched on again. This could mean that another person had just started their run, and soon I would have someone there to help me. Or that he was out looking for me, or getting ready to prey on another lonely runner. I decided against waiting to find out, and continued my way towards the main road. It was dark and I fell multiple times, my clothes getting wet from the damp vegetation, and I started to get cold. After what felt like a lifetime, I could see the 10-kilometer trail ahead and I knew I was close to the main road. Soon I could hear the traffic. Once I made it to the road, I must have looked like I was in a terrible accident. Blood from several cuts from the falling, my clothes dirty, and my face, I assume, petrified. My bright runner's shirt soon attracted the attention of a passing car. My waving and desperate shouting made it stop. The driver, a 40-ish man with his 2 kids in the backseat, spent the next 10 minutes or so trying to make sense of what I tried to say between the sobbing and crying. He asked if I wanted a ride back to the parking lot, and I told him no, please just take me home instead. At home, my husband insisted on going to the parking lot to retrieve the car, and calling the police. And report what? I asked. No crime had been committed, I just knew he was out to get me. My husband went back for the car. The driver's seat window was smashed and my phone was gone. So was the photo of my daughter that I had hanging from the mirror. I don't know what he was trying to do or why he chased me the way he did, but the look in his eyes, there was no doubt he had bad intentions. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. I wanted to put something out that was a bit longer for you guys. I'm sorry if you've heard these stories before. Hey guys, I just wanted to apologize for not releasing a video in the last few days. I've recorded like 30,000 words or so in the last few days for other channels while trying to edit and record an interactive story for you guys, which is almost done by the way. So just bear with me for a bit longer and I promise it'll be worth it. I just wanted to put something out for you guys while you're waiting for it, so here it is, and once again, thank you for the motivational Snapchats you all send me. Let's begin. Number 1. You know how we flip through the channels while comfortably laying on the couch and settle for an episode of Law & Order or Criminal Minds? You know how you see the gruesome case play out and think, whoa, this is a good one. Have you ever wondered what it'd feel like if you were the victim? In January of 2014, I went on a study abroad program to Australia. At the time, we were staying in Sydney, and most of our group was heading out that night to Pacha, Sydney for a little, or a lot of, dance fun. And I, being completely oblivious to how fun that stinking place is, decided to call it an early night and stay at the hotel. The next morning, everyone dragged in around 5 a.m. and I couldn't sleep much past their drunken entrance, so soon after I decided to head out to this side street we infamously called Burberry Street, since the Burberry store there offered free Wi-Fi. Now, call me stupid for being a 5'3" girl heading out to hang out on a foreign street by myself, but it was a beautiful, crisp Sunday morning and the streets were clean and quiet. I felt no danger ever while walking around that area. So, there I sat on the bench in front of the Burberry with headphones in while FaceTiming my then boyfriend. After a few moments I noticed a young man, maybe around 28, had sat down on the bench across from me. And me being completely caught up in the conversation, I hadn't even noticed him or that he was staring at me. The funny thing was, he had a huge grin on his face as if we were some long-lost best friends. I just politely smiled back, then went right back to FaceTiming. A few minutes passed and the young man stood up and walked into my peripheral vision and stood there anxiously stepping back and forth from left to right foot, like a child waiting to see their birthday surprise, all the while still grinning. This is when I assessed his appearance. He was dressed in black from head to toe. He even had black hair slicked back really nice and had black eyes and pale skin. I looked at him and furrowed my brow out of curiosity, and this is when he held his right hand up and seductively bit his knuckles at me. At this point, I started to feel that fight or flight instinct and stood up and started slowly backing away, keeping the man to my front and the beginning of the street to my back. He smiled even larger and started to mimic my movements, backing away while still watching me. Finally, he turned around and walked towards his end of the street, but kept looking back and grinning at me over his shoulder. I turned around too at this point and quickly whispered to my then boyfriend, who was confused as hell on the screen, what was going on and that I was going to lose Wi-Fi really quick because I was hightailing it out of there. As soon as I reached the end of the Burberry Street back to my main street, I sighed in relief and looked both ways before crossing, and to my surprise, the man had caught up to me and was standing to my left on the other side of the street, watching me while talking to someone inside a darkly tinted black car. I freaked out and took the right and began power walking towards the nearest coffee shop, only to find that the lights were on but the doors weren't unlocked yet. When I looked back to the man who was casually walking at the same speed, car following him and staying about half a block behind me, only now he wasn't smiling. At this point I started running, and damn, you always think how fast you could run with adrenaline, right? Well, when fear overcomes adrenaline, it's a different story. My legs felt like jello and every step felt as if bricks were tied to the bottom of my feet. I looked back quickly, and that's when I saw this guy right on my tail, and that is when he reached out. He yanked my arm violently. I lost balance and smack. My feet flew out from under me as I landed on the concrete in this order: elbows, palms, face, and then the rest of my body. I tried to get up as I hit the ground, but everything was dizzy and in slow motion. Thankfully, a nearby restaurant owner was unlocking the restaurant's door and saw what happened and rushed at us while shaking his fist at the man. The black car gunned it down the street, and the man smirked and held his hands up, slowly backing away and then turning around and walking swiftly away. At this point, I started shaking violently and crying out of fear and then eventually pain. The restaurant owner kindly rushed me into his shop and sat me down at the table with a pack of ice and soon a cup of coffee. Eventually, the police took a report, but nothing could be done. I refused to go to the hospital, and thankfully it was only a couple of bad bruises and skinned elbows. To this day, I still don't know the man's intentions, but I am 100% positive they weren't good ones. If that restaurant owner hadn't been coming into his shop early that day, I don't know where I would be. Number 2. This happened to my father in 1975 in a little country bumpkin town when he was 7 years old and his sister was 9. I will be typing this out as he recounts what happened. My father was a truck driver who had to be up at 2 a.m. every morning. That meant we had a rule in our house that no matter what, you can't wake Dad up when he goes to bed at 7 p.m. My mother worked at an old folks home till 10 p.m. every night. So for a couple of hours it was just me and my sister in the house by ourselves. It was our bedtime one night, so me and my sister went to bed. In a couple minutes I heard something hitting the side of the house. Then it started hitting my window. It was really weird, so I got my sister to come in my room. We looked out the window and saw a man bouncing one of my toys against the window and catching it. He put his hand to his mouth and motioned for us to be quiet. Then, he motioned for us to go outside and play with him. We were frozen in fear. Then he started walking away and we couldn't see him out the window. We ran to the kitchen, and there he was motioning for us to open the sliding glass door. We knew we couldn't wake my dad up, so we ran and hid in the living room. The man walked to our front door and started whispering something we couldn't understand and making scratching noises. All we could do was cry and remain paralyzed. We saw car lights approaching the house. It was my mother returning home from work. We watched as the man ran off the porch and hid behind my father's truck. We watched the man smile and wait till our mother got out of the car. She got out, opened the trunk, got her belongings, and walked up on the porch. I'm embarrassed to say we were too scared to open the door and warn her. All we could do was watch as the man sneakily tiptoed behind her. She opened the front door and shut it behind her. She saw us hiding, and just as she was about to yell at us for being up so late, she saw our fear-stricken eyes glued to the glass on the front door. She turned around and saw his face pressed against the glass and him jiggling the doorknob. She screamed, put all her weight against the door, locked the door, and called my grandfather, who lived a street over. Then the man shouted profanities and how he was going to rape her children in front of her. She called the police and told them as well. Next thing we know, my grandfather is speeding up the driveway with his gun out the window, just firing it randomly. The cops pulled up just as the man took off into the woods. They saw his back, but that was it. They chased through the woods with dogs and a whole squad out searching. Other officers inspected the house and saw multiple scratch marks at our doors and the side of the house. Apparently, he tried to break in and couldn't, so he tried to lure us into letting him in. They never found who it was, and that was the last we ever saw him. We were all pretty traumatized for a while, but it didn't bother our dad one bit. In fact, he didn't wake up the entire time. So, weirdo back in '75. I'm so glad we haven't met again, because if we do, you'll be the one who says, let's not meet. Number 3. Around 6 years ago, I worked in a small convenience store in a pretty quiet neighborhood. I was around 18 at the time, maybe a little older, and all of the staff members were female. With it being such a small store, we literally had 5 staff members who rotated shifts. I remember that when this incident took place, the manager had decided to take sick leave, and that left little old me to run the store as I had been working there the longest. Our tiny little shop opened at 5 in the morning, and being the good sport that I am, I decided that I would work the early shifts because the other members of staff were a little nervous with their lack of training on opening, and the fact that it was in the middle of winter, it was actually a little unnerving opening a store completely on your own while it's so dark and evidently quiet. This one morning, I opened the shutters at around 4:30 a.m. I turned on the crappy little heater as I made my way out to the back to make myself a coffee. Then went to the front of the store where our newspapers were sat, waiting to be put onto the shelves. I got the papers out and headed outside for a cigarette before opening. The few feet of snow added to the eeriness of this morning. Around 6 a.m. every morning, we would get a steady flow of builders and workmen coming in to buy a few Kit Kats and Red Bulls. Knowing them all quite well, I often took some form of comfort from knowing that if anything went wrong, I had a lot of big men heading in to save the day. This morning, 6 a.m. came and went, and I had literally not had a single customer. I bet the snow is too bad to work, I thought. I flicked through magazines and drank too much coffee just to keep occupied. At around 6:30 a.m., I popped into the kitchen to turn on the kettle, and I hear someone come in and cough at the counter. I make my way from out of the back and see a tall, lanky, intoxicated man standing there, staring at the cigarettes. I apologize for his delay and ask him what I can help with. I'm horrible. I was taken back a little bit by what this man had said, and I repeat myself and ask what I can help with. I need you to punch me in the face. I'm a terrible man. I don't know why I did it. I don't know. At this point, I was borderline shitting bricks. I know that if this man wants to hurt me, there is literally fuck all I can do. I'm tiny in comparison. I try to play it off as a joke and say something along the lines of, "Don't be crazy. I don't go punching people." The man is not amused by me. For the first time, he looks at me, leans over the counter, and starts slurring disgusting things that he wants to do to me. What if I fucked you so hard you couldn't breathe anymore? What if I made you bleed? I'm going to make you gag on me for being a slut. I need you to punch me. My heart had stopped. We had no panic buttons. The only phone I had was just out of reach, but even if I had gotten it, there was literally nowhere to lock myself in while I waited for help. I was frozen. I just stared at this man blankly until I heard, "What the fuck did you just say?" And a loud crack as I watched my bleedy raper friend's jaw was no longer in line with his face. Apparently, when I was making my coffee, 2 customers had came in. Lanky raper guy and one of my faithful builders that was later disappointed no one had informed him it was a snow day. My builder pal wrestled our lovely friend out of the store, where he managed to pretty swiftly disappear considering the amount of snow. That morning, I made my builder friend a cup of tea and didn't charge him for his purchases as a massive thank you for what he did. God knows what may have happened. Number 4. I was 13 and just had my elementary school graduation ceremony. My friends and I decided to stay outside late and celebrate. We didn't drink at the time, so our idea of celebration was playing manhunt or whatever around our neighborhood until about 8 or 9 p.m. As the sun began to set, my friends made their way home one by one. A couple of my friends and I decided to stay out a little longer. To us, this was living dangerously, especially since our neighborhood was considered extremely unsafe. My girlfriend at the time, Victoria, said she had to go home first and check in with her mother to let her know where she was, as we didn't have cell phones at the time. She said she would go home for a second and come right back. She only lived about 2 blocks away from where we were hanging out, so no one made much of it. 10 minutes had gone by and we continued to play our games. 15 minutes had gone by and she still never came back. I've always been an unusually paranoid person. I currently have an anxiety disorder, so maybe that's why. So when she didn't come back, I started getting very concerned. It didn't make sense for it to take her this long to cover 2 blocks there and back. My friends reassured me that she was probably just convincing her mother to let her stay outside. Finally, after about 20 minutes, we see Victoria coming to us and crying with scratches on her right arm. She told us that on her way back to the park there was a car following her and she started walking faster because she was getting creeped out. She's used to getting whistled at by older men. She was a pretty mature and brave girl and usually didn't lose her cool when stuff like this happened. But I recall her saying that this time, a feeling of dread and gloominess washed over her. About after 30 seconds, the car pulled up next to her and a man in a mask came out and tried to grab her. She screamed and tried fighting back. The man was about to drag her to the car when suddenly another car was driving down the road, passing by them. When it came close enough, the man let go of her arm and went back to his car and drove away while she ran for her life back to the park. By the time she got back to the park, there was only 2 people remaining, me and Victoria's best friend Jennifer. Petrified, Victoria begged us to walk her back home and said that her dad would drop me and Jennifer off at our houses. It was pretty dark at this point, so obviously we agreed. We walked through the field and were walking through our school parking lot when suddenly we got blinded by the front lights of a car. As you would suspect, the man in the mask came out of the car. At first, I thought if he got close enough, me and my 2 friends might have had a shot at overwhelming him since it was 3-on-1 and would have had a chance to get away. At the very least, I could hold him off while they made a run for it. What happened next stripped me of every last bit of courage I had while fear and panic quickly came over me. 2 other men had come out of the car. One of them was a giant. At this point, I was scared shitless. There was a few meters between us when they came out of the car, but you could still hear them talking. "Oh look, she's got a friend. Let's take her too," one of them said excitedly. I was probably the most frightened at that point. These monsters were going to take my friends and do God knows what with them. And chances are they were going to kill me if I stood in the way. I had to think quickly because they were getting closer. The parking lot was at a slight slant, sort of like a driveway, so there were bricks laid out to keep some of the teachers' cars from rolling backwards during the day. I honestly don't know what to call what I did next. It was either an act of bravery or complete insanity. I always considered myself to be a bit of a timid boy, Even cowardly at times, I always avoided fights and I used to get picked on, even though I was stronger than a lot of people in my grade. But this time, something came over me. I quickly grabbed one of the bricks beside me and threw it onto their car. It smashed their left light, which really pissed them off. I yelled at Victoria and Jennifer to run to the opposite direction while I held them off. I grabbed another brick and threw it into them when they tried to run after Victoria. It did keep them away and buy my friends a bit of time. Now, I should tell you that I ran track and I was pretty goddamn good at it. Top 3 in the city actually, so I was quite a bit strong for my age. And I was more than confident that they wouldn't catch me if I ran. After about 10 seconds, Victoria and Jennifer had covered maybe 40 meters or so, giving them enough distance between us. That really pissed the big guy off. He pulled out a box cutter and started charging at me. At this point, I ran to my left and sprinted as fast as I could and didn't look back. I ran all the way to the fence that bordered the school property. Unfortunately, it was way too tall for me to climb and the men were gaining on me quickly. Luckily, I remembered that close by, the bottom of the fences were cut open wide, enough for me to slide through. I knew this because I used to go through that hole to get into my friend Martin's backyard. By this time, the two smaller men were really close while the big fella was some ways back. I was pretty exhausted since I was running in dress clothes. On top of that, it was dark and I was having trouble finding the hole in the fence. I remember when I saw it, I ran for it as if I had been in the desert and saw an oasis of water. I tried to slide under the fence and run to Martin's back door, but one of the men had grabbed my tux jacket and tried to pull me back to their side of the fence. Growing up in this neighborhood, I had experienced a lot of scary stuff, but I had to say this was by far the scariest moment of my life. Have you ever felt that powerful feeling that transcends fear? The only word I can think of to describe it is death. I felt death. I felt my heart seize up as my limbs got heavier, all while my mind started becoming hyperactive as the stench of alcohol on the man came flooding into my nose. It was honestly as though the Grim Reaper himself was holding on to me. I knew that once I got dragged to that side of the fence, I was going to get stabbed or worse. I clutched onto the fence as tightly as I could. I didn't try to say words at first, I just tried to scream as loud as I could so anyone in the houses could hear me. Then, when I noticed a light in Martin's house along with some neighbors turn on, I started screaming for Martin and screaming for someone to please help me. Martin's dad was a very large and terrifying man, and he always keeps a machete in his house for safety. He's one guy you absolutely never want to fuck with. So when he pulled the backyard door and saw me getting dragged through the fence, he charged at us like a wild boar. The man had let go of my jacket and told his accomplices to run for it. "Shit, someone's coming, let's get the hell out of here," he said. When Martin's dad got a hold of me, he just cradled me as I sobbed uncontrollably and apparently blacked out in his arms. I don't remember it, but he recalls that I was muttering some words telling him to find Victoria, but I was talking too fast for him to understand properly and my eyes were rolling back into my head. I'm pretty sure I had a seizure. Police and ambulance came and I was taken to the emergency room. I explained to them what had happened and they went to Jennifer's house, where Victoria was staying, and got her side of the story. There wasn't much the police could have done since we didn't have any idea what they looked like since they had masks on. They also said that since incidences like this happen in my neighborhood so frequently, there was even less they could do, especially without any leads. That's the worst part of it all to me. It happens too often. Victoria moved from that area shortly after, and for the rest of the time she spent in that neighborhood, she wasn't allowed to leave her house. I too am now living in a different area. Sometimes I go back there to visit my old friends and take a walk around that school park. I loved that school, but the memory of that park still haunts me. I still get a cold shiver down my spine when I see it. I never want to go there again. Hey everyone, so the rest of this story was requested to me after my last video only containing the first part. I'm going to include that on this video just in case people haven't seen it, so if you don't want to listen to the first part, just skip ahead.
I've been sitting here in the same spot recording and editing this for hours, so I hope you enjoy the video. Don't forget to add me on Snapchat and Twitter. I will always respond. Let's begin. So, I'm in a random Starbucks in the middle of downtown Las Vegas typing this out for reasons that are beyond me. I guess that if I die, I want at least someone to know what happened to me. You're probably getting the impression that I am scared for my life, but you would be completely wrong. In fact, I'm having the most fun I've ever had. This is by far the best game I've ever played. Now, enough of my babbling. Hey everyone, this is part 2 to the day I hired a hitman story. If you haven't watched it, none of this will make sense to you and I highly recommend you go watch it. It's a long video, but it's worth the time, I promise. Click the annotation on screen or I'll have a link in the description. Let's begin. Hey everyone, I'm typing this out not for you guys, but mainly for me. I need to vent a bit and there's not many people I can talk to about this. The organization I'm working for has gone through YouTube numerous times and granted me authorization to write this. It seems not many authorities prowl through YouTube, and when they do, it's on their own time. A lot of shit has been going on in my life lately, and at the end of the day I believe I was able to turn it around and actually do some good for this evil fucking world we live in.
Just to state a couple things before this starts, these entries are all written by the same person. There will be a transition on screen between each story. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'd share them here. I've been a search and rescue officer for a few years now, and along the way I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old "stay where you are" thing and they don't wander off, but I've had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them as motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked her where her brother was, she told us that he'd been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while, and that's the last she saw of her brother. He was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in the area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched the area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest and she'd never come back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could have possibly gone because neither her mother or grandpa saw her come down. A few times, I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces. Straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine had led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into an ambulance and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her and a part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another search and rescue officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another search and rescue officer because we'd received multiple reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevice with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days and his leg was very obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he'd gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he'd fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night.
So, before we start, some background. I have a group of friends, and we've all known each other since kindergarten. There's 4 of us, me and 3 more guys. We're all 29 or 30 at the time of writing, and we're 28 or 29 at the time of the event. We're all really close, even though ever since college we meet up very rarely. All of us were in long-lasting and steady relationships, either married or the modern equivalent. That is, except for the main subject in this story, who had just come out of a pretty messy divorce. This friend, Andy, had been having a really rough time of life, as his ex-wife decided to leave him right as his mother was dying of cancer. So it was understandable that we were all a bit worried about him. Well, one of my friends has a pretty nice country house that's far away from civilization, far enough to allow for a nice weekend retreat every once in a while. At the start of this story, we had one of those trips scheduled. The week before, as we were all planning the retreat, Andy decided he wasn't going to go because he didn't want to be the only one without a significant other for the entire weekend. We all insisted, but we kind of understood his feelings, and since he had another event lined up during that weekend, we left it alone. Still, I wasn't really satisfied with that, as I felt he could really use the change of scenery. So I decided to give him a call on Saturday morning, right before I left for the country house, offer him a ride, and give him one last chance to show up. I called him from the door of my house, and he sounded kind of weird on the phone, like he was sluggish or something. I even joked with him about it. It was kind of early, and I assumed I had just woken him up. He didn't laugh or anything, so I figured he was pissed. When I offered to pick him up and give him a ride, he simply replied, "Okay." I told him to pack up a change of clothes and meet me in front of his house. Then off we went. It was me, the wife, and him in the car for a nice 45-minute drive. I started noticing things were off just as he got into the car. He was acting really stupid. I have no other way to put it. He didn't get any of the jokes, had trouble understanding simple questions, and kept replying with either a simple yes or no, or with a really slurred, short phrase at the most. At this point, me and the wife had every reason to be worried about him. We started thinking maybe he'd fallen into some weird state of depression, or started doing drugs. He refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong with him, and so we simply drove on, hoping he'd maybe open up later on. So, we all arrived. There was food and drinks and video games, Yes, we get away from civilization to play video games, and since we'd all been friends for over 20 years, there was lots of fun to be had. It quickly became obvious to all of us that Andy wasn't acting right. He wasn't playing any games, wasn't talking at all, and spent most of the time just looking at us or outside. As time went on, I noticed he wasn't eating or drinking anything at all, and one of the guys swears that he kept tabs on Andy and never once saw him go to the bathroom the entire trip. We tried to get him to talk, but he'd just give the exact same response every time. I'm okay. He ended up winning the patience game, and so we all just left him to his own devices. The night went on. He sat on a bench outside, looking at a stretch of woods near the house. We all stayed indoors talking, and then we decided to sleep. Andy said he'd go soon. He just wanted to chill for a bit outside. We all let him be. The next morning, he was sitting outside, in the exact same place we left him, in the exact same position. And that was it. I was completely freaked out, and decided it was time to go back home. We packed our stuff and said our goodbyes. Everyone was really worried about Andy, but we all felt creeped out, so we just called it a weekend and left. I drove him home, dropped him off, and went back home myself. Later that night, we ended up all meeting each other again in a restaurant for a birthday get-together of a common friend. I noticed Andy was being himself again, and my other two friends looked really puzzled. I sat down and asked him, "Hey man, what the fuck happened yesterday?" He replied with something like, "Yeah, my car broke down, and Peter here had to pick me up in the middle of the night after the bar." Well, that made no sense, and so we all started asking questions and trying to piece everything together. Turns out, he was at the bar with a couple of the other guys at the exact same time he was with us at the country house. When we kept insisting, in a kind of panic, that that was impossible, multiple people showed us pictures of him at said event. Yeah, there were fucking pictures. So we all freaked out, and noticing that we weren't joking, Andy freaked out as well. We confirmed via phone history that his phone in fact got my call that Saturday morning, but he doesn't remember answering it. After this, the talk did continue, but we really couldn't get anywhere, and that was it. As the months passed by, the three of us all got really afraid of Andy and who he could be. We still have no idea who was with us at the house, and Andy has gotten really sick of hearing about this, to the point of getting really mad when the subject comes up. He says that the most rational explanation is that we all got confused and thought this up. I'm still nervous about that to this day, especially because I dropped him off at his home and saw him enter. Where the fuck did fake Andy go? Did he do anything while we were all asleep? Do any of you guys know anything like this? I asked around, and nothing really fits. I'm not really a believer in the paranormal, but I don't have any other explanation. I felt like writing this to get it out, as the other guys and my wife don't really like talking about it. It gets everyone real nervous. My Uncle Carlos is a private investigator in Mexico, in a sort of middle-class area. Hey guys, Lazy here. Before I start the video, I'd like to say a few big thank yous. Firstly, thank you to all members of the Lazy Legion for helping me reach 200,000 subscribers. I never imagined the channel would grow this big, and it's really, really humbling that so many of you have chosen to support me. Secondly, I'd like to also thank Anthony for all of the artwork he has provided me. He's an amazing talent, and you should really check him out if you haven't already. And finally, thank you to Corpse Husband for working with me on this video. He makes a lot of awesome horror content, so make sure to check out his channel after this video, where you'll find another collaboration between the two of us. Now, on with the stories. Years ago, I was travelling solo on a cross-country trip to a family reunion. I was supposed to make it to a friend's house, but the weather was so horrible that the traffic was slow moving. Then, a terrible accident happened just ahead of me, and I was stuck for quite a while. All told, I was 5 hours behind schedule. I was exhausted, and in need of the bathroom and a shower, so I pulled into a little strip motel off of a fairly backroad state road. It was obviously small and dirty, but it would work in a pinch. There was a window to the outside where check-in was. I was a girl, college-aged. The guy at the desk eyed me up and asked if I was travelling alone. I went to hand him my ID and credit card, but he insisted cash only. Red flags were going off at this point, but I scrounged together just enough cash, and he tossed me the key. The room was dirty, barely bigger than the bed. The first thing I did was go to the bathroom. Then I flipped up the mattress. Dirty, signs of bedbugs. A moment later, I spied a cockroach. That was it. I was out. I decided I would use the parking space at least, and sleep in the back trunk hatch of my SUV. I curled up, using a suitcase for a pillow, and random clothes for a blanket, and I fell asleep for an hour. I woke up, aware of someone talking on a phone outside. I glanced out to see the guy from check-in standing just outside. This must have been around 3 AM. He finished up his call, and then walked quickly to my room, unlocked the door, and walked in. The lights didn't turn on, and a minute or two later, he came back out, slamming the door behind him, and cursing with another guy. I hadn't seen this second guy enter, so I still have no idea where he came from. They angrily talked for a moment. Then, check-in guy walked over to my SUV. I covered up my head quickly with a shirt. After he tried the locked door, he peered in the back seat, but between my tinted windows and blending into the general mess, he didn't notice me in the hatch. The two guys walked away to the far side of the lot, talking more, and one of them gesturing across the street to where the diner was. While they were distracted, I climbed up to the front seat and started the SUV. They turned around in surprise as I pulled away. I called my friends back home and told them, but I didn't want to worry my family, so I said nothing to them. When I got back home some 3 weeks later, we figured out the name of the hotel thanks to Google Maps and called the local police. The place name was something like Mountaintop or Mountainside Motel. They told me the place had been closed down, only days before I called.
My little sister used to tell me stories of the evil truck driver, as she called him. She was around 7, I was 10, maybe 11 years old. She told me he had stalked her friend and that he was now stalking her. My sister had a rather crazy imagination at the time, and I dismissed it as fiction, and so did my parents. Now, they really did have a very good reason to dismiss it. My sister made up stories like this almost every day about strange people, aliens, and teddy bears coming to life. She was a strange kid, to say the least. Anyway, one day we're playing outside in the front yard and a truck drives up the street. It's one of those old Mercedes trucks, falling apart from all the rust, and it looks like it's been in service since World War II. My sister completely freaks out and starts shouting that that's the evil truck driver. I look to the street, and sure enough, there's some seriously evil-looking dude behind the wheel just pointing at us. And then reality hits me like a brick in the face. She didn't make this one up. This shit's for real. I grab her hand and pull her into the house, crying, and lock the door. My mom was at the store and she didn't come home for another 10 minutes, so we're alone in the house. I called my mom and she came home. We never saw the driver again until a few years later we discovered the identity of the driver. Turns out he was a repeat offender child rapist and committed suicide after being charged for another assault.
This story isn't about what I've seen. It's about what I heard. It was early one morning, about 7 years ago. Me, and everyone else in my house, were awoken by the sounds of someone screaming. It was much more agonized than anything you'd expect. The voice sounded raged, as if it had been screaming for days. We lived out in the sticks, so, naturally, we assumed it was a bear attack. Upon calling the police, we found out that they had been receiving calls about the same sounds, almost 9 kilometers away from our house. As such, an animal attack in our area was unlikely. It wasn't until later that we found out that the screams were coming from a gas station attendant who was being dragged underneath a stolen car up and down the main highway by 2 arseholes high on something who ran him over simply for trying to get them to pay for their gas. The victim's name was Grant DePatie. That main drag was a ways away from us. People aren't meant to make sounds like that.
I was sitting in my room watching TV, typical 9-year-old stuff. All of a sudden I hear moaning and faint cries for help. I didn't quite understand where it was coming from since it was so foreign to me at the time. At first I thought it was my brother playing Perfect Dark because my dad always joked to my friends that people would scream bloody murder in that game, much to the annoyance of my brother. I wanted to see this in action, so I ran into my brother's room all excited, only to find that he wasn't there. I still heard it though, and still couldn't grasp what was going on. I followed the sounds through the house and stopped at the door to the garage. Right then, my gut twisted as I realized what was happening and what would be on the other side of the door. I opened the door to find my mom on the ground with a puddle of blood around her head. She was up in the attic moving stuff around, tripped, and fell through an uncovered part to the garage floor 12 feet below. I walked up to her and couldn't say anything. The only thing she could let out was, "Get Dad." And once it clicked, I ran downstairs to find my dad watching a movie with my brother at a blaring volume level. I told my dad, "Mom's hurt," and he responded, "What? What do you want?" I yelled, "Mom's hurt! Go into the garage!" And my dad's eyes widened and he sprinted upstairs. I had never seen him run that fast before. She ended up being alright, just a broken collarbone and a concussion. The experience itself was scary, but the thought that I may have saved her life is more scary to me. My mom told me after how when I found her, she was just about to lose consciousness. Had I not found her when I did, she would have lost consciousness and not been able to yell. My dad and brother couldn't hear her with the movie on, so it would have been at least 2 hours before anyone found her. Now it's just one of those things where I re-remember it and think, oh yeah, that did happen. But every once in a while, the memory makes my heart skip a beat.
Sometimes, when I'm going to sleep, I like to keep track of how weird my thoughts get right before actually falling asleep. Usually within a few minutes before I conk out, my thoughts are just a bunch of non sequiturs, stuff that doesn't make sense, but it's sort of fun to listen in. A year ago, I was going through a pretty bad time. My girlfriend dumped me for another guy, work was terribly stressful, and I only found a new apartment a couple of days before my lease was up and I had to move out. A day or two before I had to move, all my stuff was moved out, and I was sleeping on an air mattress in the living room because my bedroom had no lights and felt really empty. I was falling asleep and paying attention to how weird my thoughts were getting. Nothing too strange, just a bunch of random thoughts and phrases popping through my head, when all of a sudden, clear as a bell, I heard what sounded like a voice just a few feet away from me. I remember him saying, "Well, fuck it. Just cut him open. Oh, fuck, he can hear us," in a flat, monotone voice. I snapped up, and, of course, there was nobody there. It was just a creepy auditory hallucination, but it felt absolutely real for a few seconds, made all the worse by how strange my home felt at that moment.
On my 12th birthday, I was on the way to the bike shop to get a new bike. I was with my dad, his girlfriend, and my brother. We were still about 10 minutes away from the town center, so nowhere near the bike shop. Some random, old, creepy-looking guy came up to us, looked down at me, and said, "You buying a bike?" I looked at my dad, confused and kinda scared. We told him that we were on our way to buy a bike. He then started going on about how I must get a helmet and wear it all the time. We were a little freaked out, but we just assumed he was a weirdo and just forgot about it. A few hours later, I was riding through the park on my new bike and I fell off. I didn't fall very hard and landed on the grass, so it was fine. As I went to get up and brush myself off, I looked up and he was just standing there looking disappointed and shaking his head. He then pointed his index finger at me and said, "I told you to wear a helmet." At this point, I just shit myself and rode as fast as I could home. What is even weirder, though, is the fact that I have moved about 40 to 50 miles away since then, and I still see him every once in a while. I don't believe in guardian angels or anything like that, but it just creeps me out.
I once watched a Domino's delivery woman die in my driveway while seeing stuffed animals and a world's best grandma sticker on the back of her van. Two teens were hanging out in front of our house. They ordered pizza to be delivered there, shot her, and stole $22. There was a third teen who wasn't involved directly with the shooting. From what I understand, he talked them into it. They had robbed delivery drivers before, but this was the first time they shot someone. They were 15, 16, and 18 years old. They were all caught, and all found guilty.
I have a friend who lives about 90 minutes north of me, and he comes down to spend the weekend at our place every couple of weeks. We do a thing on Friday up near his house and then drive back to my place together at about 1 a.m. One Friday night, we're driving down the bypass to the highway and he suddenly startles in his seat and comments, "For a second I thought we'd both died and we'd be driving down the bypass forever." Well, that's a fucking morbid thought, but I just laugh and tell him that it would suck to be driving down a bypass for all of eternity. He comments something to the effect of, "Yeah, well, I wouldn't just want you for company forever, so I'd probably start haunting other cars, jumping out in front of them to cause an accident so we can have some company on the bypass." We drop the subject not long after, and by this point we've turned onto the highway. About 10 minutes later, I go over this crest on the road and have to slam on the brakes because there's a man that has just jumped out onto the road directly into the path of my car. At first I think I planned to stop, and then I guess I either got spooked by it or realized I couldn't stop in time to avoid hitting him, and I pulled into the other lane to go around him instead. I look in my rearview mirror to see what he's doing, preparing to speculate on it. I think I started to say something like, wouldn't it be creepy if he just disappeared? And then realized that he just gotten into a car and started driving. He ended up tailgating us down most of the highway until I got freaked out and took a random exit. He put his blinker on as though he was going to take the same exit, and then he pulled into the other lane instead and sped away. I don't know what was going on, and it was probably not nearly as spooky as it seemed to be at like 1:30 a.m., but I didn't sleep well that night.
When I was a youth, there was an explosion at a chemical plant down the street from my house. It wasn't a massive environmental ruining explosion, but it was still kind of a big scene. I remember being on my porch, playing my Game Boy, and looking up to see two men on fire, their skin practically melting off their bodies, running down the street and shrieking like banshees. One of them collapsed and died on the spot, and the other one kept running for God knows how long. I had nightmares for weeks.
I was riding my bike home late one night, and coming my way is a big guy with sunglasses on. He gets me to stop and says, "Do you mind if I ask you some questions?" The fact that he said questions weirded me out, so I said, no, sorry, I have to go," and I started riding away. At the next block there was a red light, so I stopped. I look back and the guy is running towards me. He is about 20 feet away and I freak out and just go. He got as close as 5 feet from me before I pulled away. So I'm pedaling on my bike, and like 3 or 4 blocks later I think I'm far enough away and I look back. He's still chasing me. I never pedaled so hard in my life, all the way home.
Hey guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to check out Corpse Husband, he makes some great horror content. Leave all your experiences and video suggestions down in the comments, and you'll hear from me again very, very soon. Stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.